4 years ago, I lived in a very small one-bedroom house with one of my best friends, Mike. We couldn't afford anything bigger, so that's why we settled with a one-bedroom. I slept on the futon in the living room, and Mike slept in the actual bedroom. The house sat on the edge of town, tucked away on a quiet street lined with similar modest dwellings, most occupied by other 20-somethings struggling to make rent or elderly folks who'd been there for decades. Our little house had character, as realtors euphemistically say about places with structural issues. The floorboards creaked with every step. The windows whistled when the wind picked up. The plumbing groaned like it was in pain whenever someone turned on the faucet. But it was ours, or at least the landlord's property that we temporarily called home. I worked at the local hardware store, while Mike handled night shifts at a warehouse across town. Our schedules barely overlapped, which was probably for the best, given how cramped our living arrangement was. The living room doubled as my bedroom, with the futon serving as both couch and bed. My clothes lived in plastic storage bins tucked against the wall. My privacy consisted of a decorative folding screen I'd found at a garage sale that I set up at night, creating the illusion of having my own space. "I'm heading out tomorrow morning," Mike announced one Thursday evening in early October, as we ate reheated pizza on the couch. "Visiting Jennifer for the weekend." Jennifer was his sister who lived about 3 hours north. She had a real job, the kind with benefits and paid vacation, and a proper 2-bedroom apartment. Mike visited her occasionally, usually returning with leftovers from home-cooked meals and stories about how we needed to get our lives together. "Whole place to myself, huh?" I said, trying not to sound too excited. Mike caught my tone anyway. "Try not to throw any wild parties while I'm gone," he joked, knowing full well that my idea of a wild time was watching movies without headphones. "I'll try to restrain myself," I replied. "When are you coming back?" "Monday evening, probably. Jennifer wants to show me around her new office on Monday morning, so I'll head back after lunch." I nodded, already mentally planning my weekend of solitude. Don't get me wrong, Mike was a great roommate and friend. We'd known each other since high school, but living in such close quarters meant we were constantly in each other's space. A weekend alone sounded like heaven. The next morning, I woke to the sound of Mike zipping his duffel bag. The early autumn light filtered weakly through our thin curtains. The house had started to get chilly at night, but our landlord insisted we couldn't turn on the heat until November. "There's leftover Chinese in the fridge," Mike said, hoisting his bag onto his shoulder. "Try not to burn the place down." "No promises," I replied, still bundled in my blankets. "Say hi to Jennifer for me." "Will do. See you Monday." The door closed behind him, and I heard his car start up and pull away. Just like that, I had the whole house to myself. I stretched out on the futon, enjoying the rare feeling of complete privacy. The house seemed different somehow, quieter but also larger, as if the walls had expanded slightly with Mike's departure. I dozed for another hour before getting up to make coffee. Friday was my day off, and I intended to make the most of it. I spent the morning doing laundry, taking an uninterrupted shower, a luxury when sharing a tiny bathroom, and cleaning up my corner of the living room. By afternoon, I'd settled into a pleasant rhythm of having the house to myself. I could play music without headphones. I could leave dishes in the sink without feeling guilty. I could sprawl across the entire futon without curling up to make room for Mike to sit. Small freedoms, but they felt enormous after months of constant compromise. That evening, I ordered a pizza all for myself, with toppings Mike would have complained about, and watched action movies at a volume that would have earned me a pillow to the head on any normal night. The house creaked and settled around me, but the sounds felt companionable rather than intrusive. Saturday passed in similar fashion. I slept late, wandered around in my underwear just because I could, and spent hours playing video games without having to give up the TV. By evening, though, the novelty was starting to wear off. The house felt a little too quiet, a little too empty. I texted Mike. "Having fun?" His reply came an hour later. "Jennifer made lasagna. Your meal of microwave burritos suddenly seems sad, doesn't it?" I laughed and sent back a middle finger emoji. It was strange how quickly I'd gone from craving solitude to missing his company. Still, I had one more full day to enjoy the place to myself. Sunday morning brought a chill that seeped through the old windows. I bundled up in sweats and spent the first part of the day watching football, feeling lazy and content. By late afternoon, I realized I needed groceries. The refrigerator contained little more than condiments and a suspicious-looking yogurt well past its expiration date. As I grabbed my keys and wallet, I noticed the sun was already dipping toward the horizon. Fall days were getting shorter, and darkness came earlier each evening. A gusty wind had picked up, sending dried leaves skittering across our small front yard. Something about the gathering darkness made me hesitate at the door, a fleeting unease I couldn't explain. "Don't be stupid," I muttered to myself, locking the door behind me. I had no idea that when I returned, things would never be the same again. The grocery store's fluorescent lights felt harsh after the soft autumn twilight. I wandered the aisles somewhat aimlessly, dropping items into my cart: milk, bread, eggs, instant noodles, frozen pizzas. The bachelor's survival kit. The store was mostly empty, just a few other Sunday evening shoppers finishing their errands before the work week began. "Cold front coming in tonight," the cashier commented as he rang up my items. "Supposed to drop below freezing." "Guess summer's officially over," I replied, watching the total climb higher than I'd expected. "You got that right. Better bundle up." By the time I pulled into our driveway, darkness had completely fallen. The wind had picked up even more, whistling through the trees that lined our street. I struggled to balance the grocery bags while fumbling with my keys. Our porch light was dim and yellowed, casting more shadows than illumination. Finally inside, I set the bags on the kitchen counter and went back to close the door. As I turned the deadbolt, I paused. Something felt different. I couldn't place it exactly. The house was exactly as I'd left it. TV remote on the arm of the futon. My coffee mug still on the table. The pile of laundry I hadn't bothered to fold sitting in the basket. Maybe it was just the temperature. The house felt colder than when I'd left, despite having been gone less than an hour. I adjusted the thermostat, then remembered our landlord's rule about the heat. Instead, I grabbed a hoodie from my laundry pile and pulled it on. As I put away the groceries, I kept glancing over my shoulder, unable to shake the feeling that something was off. The house had always made noises, settling sounds, creaking pipes, the hum of the refrigerator. But tonight they seemed louder, more insistent. "Get it together," I muttered to myself. "It's just empty house syndrome." By 7 o'clock, I'd made myself a sandwich and settled on the futon. Given the unusual circumstance of having the place to myself for one more night, I decided to stay up a little later and watch a movie. Something with lots of explosions to fill the silence. I scrolled through options, finally selecting an action thriller I'd been wanting to see. As the opening credits rolled, I sank deeper into the cushions, trying to ignore the occasional gusts of wind that made the windows rattle. An hour into the movie, just as the protagonist was about to confront the main villain, there was a quiet thump from down the hallway. I looked over, not seeing anything, and figured it was just the house settling. Old buildings made noises, that was normal. I turned back to the movie, but found myself straining to hear above the dialogue. For the next 30 minutes, there were no other sounds, so the thump was completely insignificant and had fully left my mind. The movie reached its climax, a convoluted sequence involving a high-speed chase and improbable stunts. I tried to lose myself in it, but kept finding my attention wandering. When the credits finally rolled, I realized I'd barely registered the last 20 minutes of the film. Something about being alone in the house at night had me on edge. I'd spent Friday and Saturday nights alone without any issues. Why was tonight different? I checked my phone. 10:15 p.m. Mike wouldn't be back until tomorrow evening. I had work in the morning, so I needed to get to sleep soon anyway. After filling up my water bottle, I went back to the futon and pulled it out into a bed. The metal frame squeaked loudly in the quiet house. I arranged my pillow and blankets, then lay down, scrolling through my phone to distract myself from the persistent unease. Outside, the wind had died down, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. The usual ambient noises of the neighborhood, distant traffic, the neighbor's dog, people arriving home from evening outings, were absent. It was as if the whole world had gone still. I set my phone on the side table and turned off the lamp. Darkness enveloped the small living room, broken only by the green glow of the microwave clock in the adjacent kitchenette. I closed my eyes, trying to quiet my mind. Just as I was drifting off, I thought I heard something, a soft creak from the direction of the hallway, so faint I might have imagined it. My eyes snapped open, staring into the darkness. The silence stretched out, unbroken by any further sounds. Eventually, my eyelids grew heavy again, and I succumbed to sleep. I'm not sure how long I slept before something woke me. My eyes felt really heavy and my vision was blurry. The living room was pitch black except for the microwave's clock, 2:37 a.m. I blinked, trying to figure out what had disturbed my sleep. Then I heard it, a very faint sound from the other side of the house. Wood creaking, like someone carefully walking across the floorboards. My heart began pounding immediately, blood rushing in my ears. I sat perfectly still, straining to hear above my own breathing. There it was again, a distinct creak, the sound of weight being placed carefully on the old wooden floor. Mike wasn't due back until tomorrow. No one else had keys to our house. Someone was inside. I slid quietly off the futon, my bare feet touching the cold floor. My phone was on the side table. I needed to reach it without making noise. Moving as silently as possible, I extended my arm and wrapped my fingers around it. The creaking had stopped. The house was silent again. A silence so complete it seemed to press against my eardrums. Maybe I'd imagined it. Maybe it was just the house settling after all. But deep down, I knew better. There was someone else in the house with me. I stood frozen, clutching my phone, torn between hiding and investigating. If I called the police and it turned out to be nothing, I'd feel like an idiot. But if someone was actually in the house... Another creak, closer this time, coming from the hallway that led to Mike's bedroom. My eyes had adjusted to the darkness, and I could make out the shadowy outline of the hallway entrance. Nothing moved there, but somehow the darkness seemed deeper, more solid than it should be. I needed to be sure. Summoning every ounce of courage, I took a step toward the hallway. My heart rate skyrocketed as I approached the hallway, each step feeling like I was moving through molasses. The short corridor to Mike's bedroom had never seemed so long or ominous before. I kept my phone gripped tightly in my hand, its screen dark to avoid broadcasting my position. The creaking had stopped, but I couldn't shake the certainty that someone was there, waiting in the darkness. The rational part of my brain offered alternative explanations. The house contracting in the cold night air, a stray animal somehow finding its way inside, my own imagination working overtime after a weekend of solitude. I reached the beginning of the hallway and paused, listening intently. Nothing. The silence was almost worse than the creaking. At least the sound had given me something to track. Now I was facing a void of information with nothing but my mounting fear to guide me. "Hello?" I called out weakly, immediately regretting it. If there was someone in the house, I'd just revealed my position and that I was awake. No response came, just the pressing silence. Taking a deep breath, I inched down the hallway, running my hand along the wall for guidance. The floorboards beneath my feet felt cool and seemed to amplify every slight movement. I tried to step where I knew the floor was less likely to creak, a skill developed over months of living in this old house. As I approached Mike's bedroom door at the end of the hallway, that feeling of wrongness intensified. The door was closed, which was normal when Mike wasn't home. What wasn't normal was the faint scent lingering in the air, something foreign to our usual household smells, something vaguely human but unfamiliar, a blend of unwashed clothes, stale sweat, and something else I couldn't identify. Standing before the door, I found myself paralyzed with indecision. If someone was inside, opening the door would alert them to my presence. But I needed to know for sure before calling the police. I leaned against the door, pressing my ear to the wood, and listened. It was quiet, not even a sound coming from inside. I slowly twisted the door handle and pushed it open a few inches, moving my eyes across the sliver of room revealed as I continued to open the door wider. Moonlight filtered through the thin curtains, casting the room in a pale, ghostly glow. At first glance, it looked empty. but I quickly noticed how messy the room was. There were things scattered around all over the floor and bed. Mike's belongings strewn about in a way completely unlike his usual neat habits. Clothes pulled from his dresser, books knocked from shelves, the contents of his desk drawer emptied onto the floor. Confused, I took a step into the room and flicked on the light. The sudden brightness momentarily blinded me, and as my vision adjusted, movement caught the corner of my eye, a figure shifting away from the gap between the closet doors. Pure adrenaline surged through my body. I jumped backward out of the room and slammed the door shut, then ran to get my phone as I heard the closet door sliding open and heavy footsteps moving into the bedroom. My hands trembled so badly I could barely grip my phone. I fumbled with it, trying to unlock the screen to dial 911. Behind me, I heard the bedroom door opening, followed by deliberate footsteps coming down the hallway. I ran to the back door, glancing over my shoulder to see a large man emerging from the hallway. In that brief moment, I registered only vague details. Tall, bulky build, dark clothing, face partially obscured by what looked like a hood or mask. His presence seemed to fill the small living room, making the space I'd called home feel alien and threatening. I burst through the back door into the freezing night air, not bothering to close it behind me. Our backyard was small and opened onto a wooded area that separated our street from the next one over. I sprinted across the patchy grass, my bare feet stinging against the cold ground, expecting at any moment to hear pursuit. But the man didn't follow. I reached the tree line and ducked behind a thick trunk, gasping for breath, my trembling fingers finally managing to dial 911. 911, what's your emergency? The dispatcher's calm voice seemed surreal against the backdrop of my terror. Someone's in my house, I panted. There's an intruder in my house right now. Is the intruder still inside? Yes, I don't know. I ran out. He was hiding in my roommate's closet. The dispatcher took my address and assured me officers were being dispatched immediately. Are you in a safe location? She asked. I think so. I'm in the woods behind the house. Stay where you are. Do not re-enter the residence. Officers should arrive in approximately 5 minutes. Those 5 minutes stretched into an eternity. I stood shivering in the dark woods, scanning constantly between the trees and my house's back door, which remained open, spilling yellow light onto the yard. There was no sign of the intruder following me. Had he fled? Was he still inside? Was he circling around through the woods to find me? Every snapping twig or rustling leaf sent a fresh spike of fear through me. My feet had gone numb from the cold ground, and I huddled against the tree trunk, trying to make myself as small as possible. Finally, I saw flashing lights reflecting through the trees as patrol cars pulled up in front of my house. The dispatcher, who had stayed on the line the entire time, told me to identify myself to the officers. I emerged cautiously from the woods, waving my phone to show the call was still connected. 2 officers approached with flashlights while others entered the house through the front door, hands on their holstered weapons. Are you hurt, sir? One officer asked as they reached me. I shook my head, teeth chattering from both cold and fear. No, but someone's in there, in my roommate's bedroom. They escorted me to a patrol car, where I sat in the back seat with a blanket around my shoulders. More officers arrived, and I watched as they methodically searched the property, flashlight beams sweeping across the yard and through the trees. After what seemed like an hour, an officer approached the car. We've cleared the residence, he said. There's no one inside now. He must have run when I left, I said, relief mixing with lingering fear. We'd like you to come take a look. Tell us if anything's missing, or if you notice anything that might help us figure out who was in there. I nodded, though the thought of re-entering the house filled me with dread. Walking back inside felt surreal, like entering a place I'd never been before rather than where I lived. Officers stood in the living room taking notes and speaking into radios. My futon was exactly as I'd left it, blankets thrown back from my hasty exit. Your roommate's room is quite disturbed, one officer said. Was it like that before? I shook my head. No, Mike is very neat. Someone went through his things. They led me down the hallway to Mike's room. The chaos was even worse under the bright overhead light. Drawers emptied, mattress partially pulled off the bed frame, closet doors standing open to reveal clothes pulled from hangers. Any idea what they might have been looking for? The officer asked. I don't know, I replied honestly. We don't have anything valuable, just typical broke 20-something stuff. A female officer appeared at the doorway. We found the point of entry. Kitchen window had the lock jimmied. Pretty clean job. Probably used a credit card or thin tool to push back the latch. Any signs of the suspect outside? Asked the first officer. She shook her head. Nothing conclusive. Ground's too hard for footprints. We'll canvass the neighborhood tomorrow, see if anyone saw anything suspicious. I stood in the middle of Mike's violated room, arms wrapped around myself, still shaking slightly. Do you think he'll come back? The officers exchanged glances I couldn't quite interpret. We'll increase patrols in this area for the next few days, the female officer said. But it might be good to have someone stay with you tonight, or to stay somewhere else if you can. Reality crashed down on me then. It was nearly 4 a.m. I had work in just a few hours. Mike wouldn't be back until tomorrow evening. And someone had broken into our home while I was sleeping less than 30 feet away. Is there someone you can call? The officer prompted gently. I nodded slowly, trying to think of who might take me in at this hour. Yeah, I'll call someone. Dawn broke cold and gray as I sat in my car outside the police station, waiting for the detective to arrive. After the officers had finished processing our house as a crime scene, I'd called my coworker, Trevor, who'd grudgingly agreed to let me crash on his couch for what remained of the night. Neither of us had gotten much sleep. I'd called in sick to work. My manager had been surprisingly understanding when I explained the situation, and then contacted Mike, leaving a voicemail when he didn't answer. Now I was supposed to give a formal statement to the detective assigned to the case. The police station was a small brick building that looked more like a library than a law enforcement facility. Inside, the fluorescent lights highlighted the dark circles under my eyes as I waited in the lobby, clutching a paper cup of vending machine coffee that tasted like warm dishwater. Mr. Lambert? A middle-aged man in plain clothes approached, extending his hand. Detective Harmon. Sorry to keep you waiting. He led me to a small interview room with bare walls and a table that had seen better days. For the next hour, I recounted the events of the previous night in excruciating detail, from the first thump I'd heard to my escape through the back door. And you're certain you've never seen this individual before? Detective Harmon asked, making notes on a yellow legal pad. I barely saw him at all, I admitted. Just a glimpse as he came down the hallway, tall, heavy-set, dark clothes. Any distinguishing features, scars, tattoos, unusual clothing? I shook my head. It happened so fast, and I was focused on getting out. That's understandable, Harmon said, his tone neutral. And you mentioned the house is rented. Any recent maintenance workers, landlord visits, that sort of thing? Our landlord came by last month to fix a leak under the kitchen sink, but he always calls first. Harmon nodded, making another note. We'll check into that. In the meantime, we've increased patrols in your neighborhood, and I recommend changing the locks and possibly adding additional security measures. You think he might come back? I asked, the coffee turning acidic in my stomach. It's hard to say. The fact that he didn't immediately pursue you suggests he wasn't there primarily to confront the occupants. More likely, he was searching for something specific or just looking for valuables. Harmon closed his notepad. Do you have a safe place to stay for the next few days? I thought about Trevor's cramped apartment and uncomfortable couch. My roommate's coming back tonight. We'll figure something out. After leaving the police station, I drove aimlessly for a while, reluctant to return to the house but having nowhere else to go. Eventually, I found myself in the parking lot of a home improvement store. Inside, I filled a cart with a new deadbolt, door chain, window locks, and a baseball bat, meager defenses that nevertheless made me feel slightly more in control. By early afternoon, I was back at our house, standing on the front step, key in hand, unable to make myself unlock the door. The house looked exactly the same as it had for the past year, the peeling paint on the trim, the small concrete stoop, the overgrown shrubs flanking the entrance. But now it felt tainted, violated. Drawing a deep breath, I unlocked the door and stepped inside, half expecting to find the intruder waiting for me. The living room was empty, of course, though police fingerprint dust still covered various surfaces. I checked every room, every closet, even looking under the beds before finally accepting that I was alone. The mess in Mike's room was even worse in daylight. I started to straighten up, then stopped, unsure if I should touch anything until he returned. What would he want to do when he found out? Would he insist we move immediately? Would he blame me somehow for not preventing the break-in? My phone rang, startling me so badly I nearly dropped it. "Hello?" "What the hell, man?" Mike's voice came through, tight with tension. "I just got your voicemail. Someone broke in. Are you okay?" Relief washed over me at the sound of his voice. "Yeah, I'm okay. Scared out of my mind, but not hurt." "Jesus, I'm leaving Jennifer's now. I'll be home in a few hours." "I'm changing the locks," I told him, "and adding window locks. The police think he got in through the kitchen window." "Did they catch the guy?" "No. He was gone by the time they arrived." There was a pause. "Did you see him?" "Barely. Just enough to know he was big, and definitely not someone we know." Mike exhaled audibly. "Okay, stay there. I'm on my way." After we hung up, I set about installing the new locks with tools from our meager collection. The physical labor helped distract me from jumping at every sound, though I kept the baseball bat within reach at all times. By late afternoon, I'd replaced the front and back door locks and added reinforcements to all the windows. The house felt like a fortress now, or at least less vulnerable than before. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, of foreign eyes evaluating my security measures. Around 6, I heard a car pull into the driveway. I grabbed the bat and approached the front window cautiously, relaxing only when I recognized Mike's ancient Civic. He rushed from the car to the front door, which I opened before he could try his now useless key. "Jesus, man," he said, pulling me into a quick, tight hug. "Are you really okay?" I nodded, suddenly exhausted now that he was here. "Yeah, just freaked out." Mike looked different, tense, alert, scanning the living room as if expecting to find evidence of the intrusion. "Tell me everything," he demanded. We sat at our small kitchen table as I recounted the events of the previous night. I watched his face darken as I described finding his room ransacked, seeing the man in his closet, fleeing into the woods. "Did they take anything?" he asked when I finished. "I don't think so. My laptop's still here. The TV. I couldn't tell about your stuff." Mike stood abruptly. "Let me check my room." I followed him down the hallway, watching as he surveyed the chaos of his personal space. He moved methodically through the scattered belongings, opening drawers, checking under the mattress, looking in the closet. "Anything missing?" I asked from the doorway, unwilling to enter the room fully. He shook his head slowly. "Nothing obvious." Which is weird, right? Why break in if you're not going to steal anything? The detective thought he might have been looking for something specific. Mike froze in the act of picking up a fallen book. "Like what?" "I don't know. Do you have anything someone would want badly enough to break in for?" "No," he said too quickly. "Of course not." Something in his tone made me look at him more closely. His face was pale, his expression guarded in a way I'd never seen before. "Mike, what's going on?" He sank onto the edge of his bed, running a hand through his hair. "Nothing. I'm just processing all this. It's a lot to take in." I wanted to press him further, but exhaustion was overwhelming me. I hadn't slept more than a couple of hours in the past 24, and the adrenaline crash was hitting hard. "I need to sleep," I said. "I've been up since the break-in." Mike nodded distractedly. "Yeah, of course. Get some rest. I'll finish cleaning up in here." As I turned to leave, he called after me. "Hey, thanks for calling the police and for fixing the locks." "Sure," I replied, pausing in the doorway. "What do you think we should do? About living here, I mean." He looked around the room, his expression unreadable. "Let's talk about it tomorrow, when we've both had some sleep." That night, despite my exhaustion, sleep came fitfully. Every sound jolted me awake. The refrigerator cycling on, the heating system activating, Mike moving around in his room. I kept seeing the shadowy figure coming down the hallway, imagining what might have happened if I hadn't woken up when I did. Around midnight, I heard Mike's door open and his footsteps in the hallway. Through slitted eyes, I watched as he checked the front and back doors, testing the new locks. Then he stood at the kitchen window for a long time, staring out into the darkness, his silhouette tense and vigilant. Something had changed between us. Some essential trust in our home, in our safety, had been irrevocably broken. And I couldn't shake the feeling that Mike knew more than he was telling me about why someone had broken into our house. The next few days passed in a fog of paranoia and tension. Mike and I developed an unspoken system of double-checking locks, taking turns sleeping so one of us was always awake, jumping at unexpected sounds. We barely spoke about the break-in directly, as if naming it would somehow make the violation more real. The police called with updates that weren't really updates at all. No fingerprints, no suspects, no leads. Detective Harmon suggested the intruder might have been casing houses in the area and picked ours simply because it looked vulnerable. "These things happen sometimes," he said, a non-explanation that did nothing to ease my constant state of hypervigilance. At work, I found myself watching customers too carefully, wondering if one of them might be the man I'd glimpsed in our hallway. Every large man in dark clothing sent my heart racing. I started leaving early, driving circuitous routes home, checking the back seat of my car before getting in, behaviors I would have mocked just a week earlier. Mike seemed equally affected, though in different ways. He spent hours on his phone having hushed conversations I couldn't quite overhear. He rearranged his room multiple times, as if trying to erase any trace of the intruder's presence. And twice, I caught him staring at me with an odd, evaluating expression that disappeared the moment he realized I'd noticed. A week after the break-in, I came home from work to find Mike sitting at the kitchen table, a stack of printed papers in front of him. "What's that?" I asked, setting down my keys. "Apartment listings," he replied, sliding them toward me. "I think we need to move." Relief flooded through me. I'd been thinking the same thing, but hadn't wanted to be the one to suggest it. "Yeah?" He nodded, not quite meeting my eyes. "This place doesn't feel right anymore. And honestly, we should probably get separate places. This one-bedroom setup was always meant to be temporary." The suggestion caught me off guard. Mike and I had been friends for years, roommates for nearly 2. The idea of living alone, especially after what had happened, sent a spike of anxiety through me. "Is that what you want?" I asked carefully. He shrugged. "It makes sense, doesn't it? We're not college kids anymore. Time to grow up, get our own places." Something in his tone felt rehearsed, as if he'd practiced this conversation. "Did something happen?" I pressed. "Is this about the break-in?" Mike's expression hardened slightly. "Not everything is about that night. We were going to have to move on eventually." I sat down across from him, studying his face. "You've been acting weird ever since you got back. If there's something going on—" "There's nothing going on," he interrupted, his voice sharp. Then, more calmly, "Look, I just think it's time. For both of us. Don't you want your own space? A real bedroom instead of a futon in the living room?" Put that way, it was hard to argue. And maybe he was right. Maybe the break-in had simply accelerated a separation that was already inevitable. "Okay," I conceded. "Separate places it is." The next few weeks passed in a blur of apartment hunting, rental applications, and packing. We both found places across town from each other. Mike, in a modern complex with security cameras and a gated entrance. Me, in a converted loft above a bookstore that reminded me of apartments I'd seen in movies. On moving day, we worked mostly in silence, carrying boxes to our respective vehicles. Our meager, shared possessions were easily divided. Mike took the TV, I took the microwave, that sort of thing. It felt like the end of an era, the final chapter of our post-college transition into full adulthood. As I loaded the last of my boxes into my car, Mike approached, hands in his pockets. "So, this is it," he said awkwardly. "Guess so." He extended his hand, which seemed oddly formal after years of friendship. "We'll stay in touch, right?" I shook his hand, trying to ignore the distance I felt between us. "Of course, beers next week?" "Definitely." But we both knew it was a promise unlikely to be kept. Something had shifted between us. Some fundamental trust broken not just by the intruder, but by Mike's subsequent behavior. His secrets, his sudden desire for separation. I never did meet Mike for those beers. Our texts became less frequent, our interactions limited to occasional likes on social media. We drifted apart with surprising speed, as if our friendship had been tied specifically to that small one-bedroom house. My new apartment felt secure in ways our old place never had, Solid locks, neighbors close by, good lighting in the hallways. But for months, I continued to wake at small sounds in the night, heart pounding, certain someone was in my home. The police never found the intruder. The case file eventually joined countless others in whatever storage system housed unsolved minor crimes. Detective Harmon called once more, about a month after we moved, to ask if we'd remembered anything else that might help the investigation. We hadn't, and that was the end of it, officially. But unofficially, questions lingered. Why our house? Why Mike's room specifically? Why take nothing after going to the trouble of breaking in? Sometimes in my darker moments, I wondered if Mike had known something, if the break-in had been connected to him in ways he never shared with me. His hasty departure from our shared life seemed suspicious in retrospect, like running from something rather than toward something new. 4 years have passed since that night. I've moved twice more, each time to places with better security. I've made new friends, dated, built a life that bears little resemblance to the one I had then. I rarely think about the small one-bedroom house or the shadowy figure that changed everything. But occasionally, when I'm alone at night and the floorboards creak, or when a door closes somewhere in my building, I'm instantly transported back to that moment, waking in darkness, hearing careful footsteps, finding a stranger in my home. I saw Mike once, about a year ago, at a grocery store across town. He was in the produce section, examining avocados with intense concentration. I almost approached him, almost tapped his shoulder to say hello. But something held me back. Some instinct that warned me to leave the past undisturbed. He looked up suddenly, as if sensing my presence, and our eyes met briefly across the display of fruit. For a moment, I thought I saw recognition, perhaps even a hint of the old friendship. Then his expression changed to something guarded, something that might have been fear, and he abandoned his shopping cart, walking swiftly toward the exit. I didn't follow him. Whatever secrets he carried weren't mine to uncover. We had both moved on from that night, in our separate ways, carrying separate pieces of a story neither of us fully understood. Sometimes I still wonder about the man in the closet, who he was, what he wanted, where he is now. I wonder if he thinks about us too, the young men whose sense of safety he shattered with his presence. But mostly, I've accepted that some questions have no answers. Some stories have no neat conclusions. All we can do is change the locks, move on, and hope that the footsteps we hear in the night are just the house settling, just the wind, just our imagination. Hopefully, to never encounter that man again. Devil's Night, October 30th, 2011. The air hung heavy with that peculiar mix of autumn chill and mischief that always seems to accompany the night before Halloween. I was 22 then, still young enough to crave the thrill of fear, but old enough to know better. The streetlights flickered as we cruised through town in my boyfriend's beat-up Chevy, the radio playing something low and bass-heavy that I can't remember now. "What's the plan tonight?" I asked, glancing at my boyfriend in the driver's seat. I'll call him Mark, tall with dark hair that fell across his eyes and a smile that had convinced me to do questionable things more than once. "No clue," Mark replied, tapping his fingers against the steering wheel. "Jason's got some ideas, though. Right, man?" Jason sat in the back, lankier than Mark, with a perpetual 5 o'clock shadow and eyes that always seemed to be looking for trouble. "Devil's Night means we gotta do something worthy of the occasion," he said, leaning forward between the front seats. "Something that'll give us a story to tell." I turned to face him. "Like what?" "Ghost hunting," Jason said without hesitation. "It's practically obligatory tonight." The car rumbled beneath us as Mark took a turn too fast. "Where, though? The old cemetery is played out and the abandoned house on Maple got demolished last spring." Jason's face lit up with that look I'd come to recognize, the one that preceded his worst ideas. "The old TB hospital in Riverview. That place is legendary." My pulse quickened. I'd heard rumors about that place since high school. Originally built in the 1920s as a tuberculosis sanatorium, It had later been converted to a state psychiatric hospital before being abandoned in the 1980s. The stories that came out of there weren't pretty. Experimental treatments, patient abuse, mysterious deaths. Is it even accessible? I asked, already knowing I was going to go along with this, despite the warning bells in my head. There's always a way in, Jason assured me, his confidence never wavering. My cousin went last year, said it was the creepiest place he'd ever been. Mark glanced at me, eyebrows raised in question. You up for it? We can do something else if you want. I hesitated, my rational mind battling against my curiosity. The idea of walking through those abandoned halls where so much suffering had occurred both terrified and fascinated me. I'd always been drawn to dark history, to places where the veil between past and present, between life and whatever comes after, seemed thinnest. Let's do it, I said finally, ignoring the slight tremor in my voice. Mark smiled, that reckless grin I couldn't resist, and made a sharp U-turn toward the highway that led to Riverview. Jason whooped from the back seat, already pulling up directions on his phone. The 20-minute drive gave me time to contemplate what we were about to do. Breaking and entering wasn't exactly how I'd planned to spend my evening, but the prospect of exploring a piece of forgotten history outweighed my concerns about legality. Besides, no one seemed to care about the old hospital anymore. It had sat abandoned for decades, a decaying monument to outdated medical practices and forgotten patients. My cousin said there are still medical records scattered everywhere, Jason was saying as we exited the highway. And equipment too, like they just locked the doors one day and never came back. That can't be right, I argued, though uncertainty crept into my voice. Wouldn't they have cleared everything out? Jason shrugged. Guess we'll find out. The roads narrowed as we entered Riverview, streetlights becoming more sparse. Old Victorian houses stood like silent sentinels along tree-lined streets, their windows dark except for the occasional glow of a television or lamp. The small downtown area was nearly deserted, just a few people smoking outside the local bar, and a police car parked outside the 24-hour diner. We should park somewhere inconspicuous, Mark said, slowing the car. Don't want to make it obvious we're heading to the hospital. The bar, Jason suggested. No one will question a car parked outside a bar on Devil's Night. Mark nodded and pulled into the gravel lot behind O'Malley's, killing the engine. The sudden silence pressed in around us, broken only by the distant thump of music from inside the bar and the occasional car passing on the main road. Everyone got their phones? Mark asked, checking his pocket for his own. And flashlights? Jason produced a small but powerful LED flashlight from his jacket. I had my phone and a small pen light I kept on my keychain. Not ideal, but better than nothing. We stepped out of the car, the cold October air immediately biting at my exposed skin. I zipped my jacket higher and pulled my beanie down over my ears as we started walking toward the edge of town where the hospital waited. The first glimpse of it sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with the temperature. It stood on a hill about a quarter mile from the last residential street, surrounded by overgrown grounds that had once been meticulously maintained. Even from a distance, the Gothic Revival architecture loomed imposingly against the night sky. 4 stories of red brick, arched windows, and ornate stone trim, all crowned with a central tower that rose another 20 feet above the main structure. Holy shit, I whispered. Told you it was impressive, Jason said, a note of pride in his voice, as if he'd built the place himself. Mark squeezed my hand. We don't have to do this. But I couldn't turn back now. The hospital had already cast its spell on me, drawing me in with its dark history and forgotten secrets. As we approached the wrought iron fence that surrounded the property, I felt that peculiar mix of dread and excitement that comes from knowing you're about to do something you shouldn't. There's a gap in the fence over here, Jason said, leading us along the perimeter until we reached a section where the metal had warped and pulled away from a post, creating an opening just wide enough to slip through. One by one, we squeezed past the rusted iron spikes, our feet crunching on the overgrown gravel path that led toward the main entrance. Up close, the hospital was even more intimidating. Windows like empty eye sockets, stone gargoyles guarding the roof's edge, a massive front door barricaded with heavy chains and padlocks. I stood there, staring up at this monolith to suffering and isolation, an uneasy feeling settling deep in my stomach. Something about this place felt wrong, as if the very air around it was saturated with decades of pain and despair. "Main entrance is a no-go," Jason observed, breaking my trance. "Let's check around back." As we circled the building, staying close to the walls to avoid being seen from the road, I couldn't shake the sensation that we were being watched. Not by anyone living, but by the building itself, by whatever residual energy remained within its walls. "Are you sure about this?" I whispered to Mark. He looked at me, his face half-shadowed in the moonlight. "We can still back out." But before I could answer, Jason called out in a hushed voice from ahead of us, "Found a way in." And just like that, the decision was made. We were going in. Jason had discovered a ground floor window at the back of the building, its plywood covering loosened by previous trespassers or the elements. He was already working at the edges with a pocket knife, prying the nails loose one by one. "Keep watch," he instructed as he worked, the wood creaking under his efforts. Mark and I stood with our backs to him, scanning the darkness for any sign of movement or approaching flashlights. The hospital grounds stretched out before us, overgrown and wild, the few remaining pathway lights long since shattered or burned out. In the distance, I could make out the silhouette of a smaller outbuilding, perhaps a groundskeeper's cottage or maintenance shed, and beyond that, the faint glow from the town's street lamps. "Almost got it," Jason grunted, and I turned to see him pull the plywood panel away from the window frame, revealing a darkness deeper than the night around us. "Ladies first," Jason suggested with a grin. "Not a chance," Mark replied before I could. "I'll go in first, make sure it's safe." Mark approached the window, shining his flashlight into the opening. The beam revealed a drop of about 3 feet to a tiled floor, with dust and debris scattered across the surface. He hoisted himself up onto the windowsill, legs dangling into the darkness for a moment before he pushed himself forward and dropped down with a soft thud. "Clear," his voice echoed from inside. "Watch your step, though. There's broken glass." I went next, Mark's hands reaching up to steady me as I lowered myself into the hospital. The moment my feet touched the floor, an inexplicable wave of uneasiness washed over me, a visceral response so strong it nearly made me climb back out. The air inside was stale and damp, carrying the unmistakable smell of mold, rotting wood, and something else. Something metallic and vaguely clinical that made me think of old blood and antiseptic. "You okay?" Mark asked, noticing my expression. I nodded, not trusting my voice as I moved away from the window to make room for Jason. Jason's entrance was where everything started to go wrong. As he swung his legs through the window and prepared to drop down, something caught, his foot or his pant leg, and he twisted awkwardly, landing with a sickening sound and a sharp cry of pain. "Fuck," he hissed, immediately grabbing his knee. "Shit, shit, shit." Mark rushed to his side, helping him to a seated position against the wall. "What happened? Can you move it?" Jason grimaced, slowly extending his leg and then bending it again. "It's not broken, but damn, I twisted it good." He tried to stand, using Mark's shoulder for support, and managed to get upright, though he kept his weight off the injured leg. "Maybe we should go back," I suggested, that uneasy feeling intensifying. "This place isn't going anywhere. We can come back another time." "No way," Jason insisted, his face pale in the beam of Mark's flashlight. "I've been wanting to check this place out for years. I'm not missing the chance because of a stupid knee." Mark looked at me, his expression asking what I wanted to do. I hesitated, caught between concern for Jason and my own growing sense that we shouldn't be here. Yet that same sense made me reluctant to split up, to leave one of us alone outside while the others explored. "Can you walk?" I asked Jason. He took a tentative step, wincing but remaining upright. "Yeah, just have to take it slow. I'll be fine." While Mark talked quietly with Jason, assessing whether we should continue, I took the opportunity to examine our surroundings. We had entered what appeared to be a large reception area, with a high ceiling and grand proportions despite its state of decay. Rows of chairs were stacked along the walls, pushed there during some long-ago cleaning effort that was never completed. Dust covered everything, thick enough in places to show footprints from previous explorers. In the center of the room stood a solitary wheelchair, its leather seat cracked and peeling, one wheel slightly askew. Something about its placement felt deliberate, as if someone had positioned it there as a macabre welcome. "Why would there still be a wheelchair here?" I asked, my voice sounding too loud in the cavernous space. Mark shrugged. "Probably not worth the effort to move everything out when they closed down. Or maybe someone brought it in later." "Later? Who would bring a wheelchair here? Other explorers? Teenagers playing pranks? Who knows?" Jason had recovered enough to start hobbling forward. "Let's go deeper. There's supposed to be patient wards, treatment rooms, all kinds of stuff." I followed reluctantly, stepping carefully around debris and keeping close to Mark's stronger flashlight beam. We moved through a set of double doors into a long corridor lined with smaller rooms on both sides. Most of the doors stood open, revealing sparse interiors, metal bed frames without mattresses, built-in dressers with drawers hanging open, small windows with bars still intact. "Patient rooms," Mark whispered, though there was no need to be quiet. Jason nodded. "Check this out." He gestured toward the floor of one room, where a pile of charred papers lay scattered. "Patient files. Looks like someone tried to burn them." I knelt down, curiosity overcoming my apprehension, and picked up a partially burned folder. Inside were typed pages detailing a patient's history, treatments, and progress notes. The name and personal information had been blacked out with marker, but the clinical details remained. "Listen to this," I said, reading from the least damaged page. "Patient continues to exhibit extreme agitation and violent tendencies. Electroshock therapy increased to 3 sessions weekly. Hydrotherapy shows minimal improvement." "Jesus," Mark muttered. "There's more," I continued. "Patient claims to see figures at night, particularly a man in a doctor's coat who watches from the doorway. Clear signs of paranoid delusions. Recommend increase in sedation and restraint protocols." A shiver ran down my spine as I placed the file back among the others. The thought that someone had experienced such fear in this very room, had been dismissed and subjected to painful treatments rather than helped, filled me with a profound sadness. "This place was still operating into the 80s, Jason said, limping toward another room. "Can you imagine? This kind of treatment was happening while we were being born." We continued down the corridor, each room telling a similar story of suffering and neglect. Some contained more personal items: a hairbrush with strands still caught in the bristles, a tattered paperback book, a small stuffed animal hidden in the back of a drawer, abandoned remnants of lives that had passed through these halls. The further we progressed, the more I noticed small details that heightened my discomfort. A temperature drop that couldn't be explained by drafts alone, the occasional sound of something shifting in distant rooms, the way our flashlight beams seemed to be absorbed by the darkness rather than cutting through it. "The hospital was originally built for TB patients," Jason explained as we walked, his voice echoing slightly in the corridor. "That's why the ceilings are so high and there are so many windows. They thought fresh air and sunlight would help cure the disease." "And then?" I prompted, knowing there must be more to the story. "When antibiotics made TB hospitals obsolete, the state took it over in the 50s and converted it to a psychiatric facility. That's when the real horror stories started." Jason paused at an intersection of hallways, considering which way to go. This way should lead to the treatment wing. He was right. The next area we entered contained larger rooms filled with specialized equipment. A room with hulking metal tubs still bolted to the floor, the infamous ice baths used to calm agitated patients. Another with a chair fitted with restraints and electrical equipment nearby, the electroshock therapy room. In one particularly disturbing room, we found a metal examination table with leather straps hanging from its sides, and nearby, a tray of rusted surgical instruments. The walls were tiled in institutional green, many cracked or missing, and a large drain in the center of the floor suggested that whatever happened here often needed to be washed away. "I think I've seen enough of this room," I said, backing toward the door. As we exited, Jason pointed down another hallway. "That way leads to the cafeteria, and if we go right, we should find the elevators and stairs to the upper floors." The hallway terminated in a T intersection, just as Jason had described. To the left, through a set of swinging doors, I could make out the outlines of long tables and chairs. The cafeteria. To the right, a wider corridor led to a bank of elevators and a stairwell entrance. Something caught my eye along the wall. A dusty chalkboard, perhaps from when the hospital had educational programs for longer-term patients. Without thinking, I picked up a stub of chalk from the metal tray and wrote my name in large letters. As soon as I finished the final letter, I felt a shift in the air, subtle but unmistakable, like the change in pressure before a storm. I turned back toward the guys who had continued a few steps ahead. "Did you feel that?" I asked. Mark looked back at me, brow furrowed. "Feel what?" Before I could answer, I noticed something that shouldn't have been possible. Above the elevator doors, an emergency exit sign had illuminated, casting a faint red glow over the corridor. And inside the elevator shaft, visible through the open doors where the car sat at the bottom level, small emergency lights glowed along the walls. "The lights," I whispered, pointing. "They're on." "That's not possible," Mark said, moving closer to examine them. "This place hasn't had power in decades." Jason limped over to join us, his face ghostly in the red glow from the exit sign. "Maybe they're on a separate emergency system, battery backup or something?" "For 30 years?" I countered, my voice rising with fear. "No battery lasts that long." And then, as if responding to our discussion, lights began to flicker on throughout the wing we'd just explored. Distant at first, then closer, moving toward us like someone was walking through the building, flipping switches as they went. "We need to hide," Mark said urgently, grabbing my arm. "Now!" The sudden illumination of the long-abandoned hospital sent us into a panic. From outside, a beam of light swept across the windows, momentarily blinding us as it penetrated the dusty glass. "Cops," Jason hissed, already hobbling toward an alcove. "We're busted if they catch us." We scattered in an instant, driven by primal fear and the very real threat of trespassing charges. Mark ducked left behind a pile of overturned cafeteria tables. Jason squeezed himself into a narrow space between a filing cabinet and the wall to my right. I pressed myself against the wall directly beside the open elevator shaft, trying to make myself as small as possible. My heart hammered in my chest, each beat reverberating through my body with such force I was certain anyone within 20 feet could hear it. The flashlight outside continued its methodical sweep of the building, creating moving shadows across the walls and ceiling as it passed each window. We remained frozen in our hiding spots as minutes crawled by. 10 minutes, 20. The light outside maintained its relentless pattern, appearing at one window, disappearing, then reappearing at the next in a clockwise circuit around the building. That's when I began to notice the other sounds. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, my fear-heightened senses interpreting the normal creaks and groans of an old building as something more. But as I listened, the sounds became more distinct, more purposeful. Footsteps on the floor above us, slow and deliberate. The scrape of furniture being moved in distant rooms, doors opening and closing throughout the building. Mark caught my eye from his hiding place and mouthed, "Do you hear that?" I nodded, a cold sweat breaking out across my skin despite the chill in the air. The sounds grew closer, footsteps in the hallway we had just explored, moving toward our position. Not the heavy tread of police boots, but softer, more measured steps, like someone wearing hospital shoes on the tiled floor. I held my breath as the footsteps approached the intersection where we were hiding. In the dim red glow from the exit sign, I could see the terror etched on Mark's face, mirroring my own. Jason had pressed himself so hard against the wall he seemed to be trying to disappear into it. The footsteps stopped just before reaching the intersection. A door creaked open, the same door to the electroshock therapy room we had explored earlier. Then came a sound that turned my blood to ice, the distinct hum of electrical equipment powering up, followed by a series of clicks as switches were flipped. "That's impossible," I thought frantically. "There's no power. The building is abandoned." Yet the evidence of my senses contradicted what I knew to be true. The exit sign still glowed red above me. The emergency lights in the elevator shaft cast ghostly shadows across the floor. And now, from down the hall, came the unmistakable sound of electrical current. More footsteps joined the first set. Multiple people now, moving through the building with purpose. Above us, something heavy dragged across the floor, as if a bed or table was being repositioned. From somewhere deeper in the building came a sound that might have been human, a moan, low and filled with pain. I wanted to run, to grab Mark and Jason and flee this cursed place. But the sweeping light outside reminded me that escape wasn't an option. We were trapped between whatever prowled the halls inside and the authorities outside. The minutes stretched into an agonizing half-hour. My legs cramped from maintaining my position, but I dared not move. The activity around us continued unabated. A hospital seemingly returned to life, populated by invisible staff going about their grim business. Then came a moment that would be forever burned into my memory. As the exterior light made another sweep past the windows, illuminating the corridor momentarily, I glanced toward the hallway we had explored earlier. A figure stepped into view at the far end, a man in a white coat, his posture straight and professional. In the brief moment before the light passed, I could make out the outline of a stethoscope around his neck and what appeared to be a patient chart in his hand. I blinked, certain my mind was playing tricks on me. But when the light swept back, he was closer, moving purposefully down the hall toward our position. With each pass of the light, he advanced, his features becoming more distinct, a man in his 50s with silver-streaked dark hair, wire-rimmed glasses, and a stern expression. On the final sweep before he would reach the intersection where we hid, our eyes met. His face registered surprise, then what I can only describe as fury. He raised his arms in an aggressive gesture, and then, as the light moved on and plunged the corridor back into relative darkness, he turned and walked away, disappearing down the hall we had come from. "Did you see that?" I whispered urgently to Mark, no longer caring about being quiet. Mark shook his head, his eyes wide with confusion. "See what?" "The doctor. He was right there. He looked right at me." "There was no doctor," Mark replied, his voice trembling. "I was looking at the same spot. There was nothing there." I turned to Jason, desperate for confirmation. "Jason, did you see him?" Jason's face was pale, his expression haunted. "I didn't see anyone, but I felt something walk past me, cold, like walking through a freezer." A rising sense of panic threatened to overwhelm me. Had I hallucinated the doctor? But he had seemed so real, so solid. The way he had reacted to seeing me, the anger in his eyes. How could I have imagined those details? "We need to get out of here," I said, no longer whispering. "Now, I don't care if the cops are out there." Mark nodded, rising cautiously from his hiding place. "Jason, you okay to move?" Jason struggled to his feet, wincing as he put weight on his injured knee. "Yeah, let's just go. This place is seriously wrong." We abandoned our hiding spots and regrouped in the center of the intersection. The red exit sign still cast its eerie glow over us, but the other lights that had mysteriously illuminated had gone dark again. Outside, the sweeping beam continued its relentless circuit of the building. "Back the way we came," Mark decided, taking the lead. "We'll surrender to the police outside. Better than whatever is in here with us." We retraced our steps down the long corridor, moving as quickly as Jason's injury would allow. Every shadow seemed to conceal a threat, every darkened doorway a potential ambush. The sounds continued around us, footsteps keeping pace behind us, doors opening and closing in our wake, whispers just at the edge of hearing. As we passed the treatment rooms, I glanced inside the electroshock therapy room. In the brief flash of my flashlight beam, I could have sworn I saw a figure strapped to the chair, body arching in silent agony as current flowed through it. I looked away immediately, afraid that a longer look would confirm what my peripheral vision had glimpsed. The reception area where we had entered appeared ahead, moonlight filtering through the window, creating silver squares on the dusty floor. The wheelchair that had seemed so ominously placed earlier was no longer in the center of the room. It now sat directly in front of our exit window, as if positioned to block our escape. "Did one of you move that?" I asked, my voice barely audible. Both Mark and Jason shook their heads, their expressions confirming my fear. None of us had touched it. Mark approached cautiously and pushed the wheelchair aside, the rusted wheels squeaking in protest. The sound echoed through the reception area, unnaturally loud in the tense silence. "I'll go first," Mark whispered, already climbing onto the windowsill. "Then help Jason through, since his knee is messed up. You come last." I nodded, keeping my flashlight trained on the doorway through which we had just come, half expecting to see the doctor's figure materialize there. Mark slipped through the window and dropped to the ground outside. I heard his feet crunch on the gravel, then his hands appeared at the window edge, ready to help Jason. "Come on," I urged Jason, supporting him as he awkwardly raised himself onto the windowsill. Jason grunted with pain as he maneuvered his injured leg through the opening. With Mark pulling from outside and me pushing from within, we managed to get him through the window and safely to the ground. Only then did I allow myself to look back at the hospital's interior one last time. The beam of my flashlight caught something moving at the far end of the reception area, a white coat disappearing through a doorway, there and gone so quickly I might have imagined it. "Hurry up," Mark hissed from outside. I didn't need to be told twice. I scrambled onto the windowsill and was halfway through when I felt something cold brush against my ankle. Fingers, or what felt like fingers, gripping briefly before letting go. I jerked my leg violently, tumbling through the window and landing hard on the gravel outside. Mark helped me to my feet, his face a mask of concern. "Are you okay? What happened?" "Something grabbed me," I gasped, backing away from the window. "Inside, it grabbed my ankle." Mark shined his flashlight through the window, revealing nothing but the empty reception area. The wheelchair now returned to its original position in the center of the room. "Let's go," Jason urged from where he leaned against the building wall, before the cops circled back around. We made our way along the back of the hospital, moving as quickly and quietly as possible given Jason's injury. The sweeping beam of light continued its circuit of the building, and we timed our movements to avoid being caught in its glare. As we rounded the corner of the building, heading toward the gap in the fence where we had entered, we came face to face with the source of the light. A police officer holding a high-powered flashlight, his cruiser parked on the gravel road nearby. "Freeze!" he shouted, his free hand moving to the holster at his hip. "Hands where I can see them!" We raised our hands instantly, the instinctive response of guilty trespassers caught in the act. The officer's flashlight beam blinded us, making it impossible to see his face or read his expression. "Against the wall!" he barked. "Spread 'em!" One by one, he pulled us away from the building and positioned us against the brick wall, legs spread and hands pressed flat against the rough surface. I could feel my heart pounding against my ribs as he patted down Mark first, then Jason, and finally me, checking for weapons or contraband. "IDs," he demanded once he was satisfied we weren't armed. We fumbled for our wallets and handed over our driver's licenses. The officer examined each one under his flashlight beam, then tucked them into his shirt pocket. "Breaking and entering is a criminal offense," he stated flatly. "You're all looking at potential jail time, not to mention fines." "We're sorry, officer," Mark began, trying to sound contrite. "We were just—" "Save it," the officer cut him off. "I've heard every excuse in the book from kids like you. What's wrong with your leg?" he asked Jason. "Twisted my knee climbing in," Jason admitted. "It's nothing serious." The officer grunted, seemingly unsurprised. "Anyone else in there with you?" "No, sir," I replied quickly. "It's just us." The officer's flashlight beam moved back to my face, making me squint. "You sure about that? Because we've been getting calls all night about activity in that building. Lights going on and off, shadows moving past windows. We've been circling the building for the past hour and kept seeing people inside." A cold shiver ran down my spine at his words. That was us, moving around with our flashlights," I lied, though my voice betrayed my uncertainty. "Is that so?" The officer sounded skeptical. "And I suppose you were also on the 3rd floor 20 minutes ago, and in the east wing at the same time?" We exchanged alarmed glances. We had never gone above the ground floor, and had stayed exclusively in the western section of the building. "No," Mark admitted slowly. "We stuck to the ground floor. Just the main reception area and the first hallway." The officer was silent for a moment, his flashlight beam moving between our faces as if searching for deception. "So you're telling me you three were the only ones in there, but you never went upstairs?" "Yes, sir," Jason confirmed. We couldn't have gone upstairs even if we wanted to. My knee is messed up." Something in the officer's demeanor changed. A subtle shift from stern authority to something closer to concern. "Turn around, all of you." We complied, our backs now against the wall, finally able to see the officer properly. He was older than I'd expected, probably in his 50s, with a weathered face and gray hair visible beneath his cap. His name badge read Sullivan. "You kids have no idea what you've been messing with," Officer Sullivan said, his voice quieter now. "This place isn't just some abandoned building for your Halloween thrills. There's a reason it's boarded up, a reason no one has torn it down despite years of proposals." "What reason is that?" I found myself asking. Sullivan's gaze moved to the upper windows of the hospital, then back to us. "Let's just say this place has a history that didn't end when they closed the doors. I've been responding to calls here for 25 years, and I've seen things I can't explain. Things that made me request never to be assigned here alone. A chill that had nothing to do with the October night ran through me. What kinds of things? Figures in the windows, lights that couldn't possibly be working, sounds coming from inside when the building was securely locked." Sullivan paused, seeming to debate whether to continue. "About 15 years ago, my partner and I responded to a call similar to tonight's. We found a group of college kids who'd broken in on a dare. One of them was catatonic when we found him, just staring at nothing, completely unresponsive. He spent 6 months in psychiatric care afterward, and to this day, he won't talk about what he saw inside." The three of us exchanged uneasy glances, the officer's words confirming our own terrifying experience. "Officer," I began hesitantly, "when we were in there, we heard noises, like people moving around, doors opening and closing. And I saw someone, a doctor in a white coat. He looked right at me." Sullivan's expression remained neutral, but something flickered in his eyes. Recognition, perhaps, or confirmation of a long-held belief. "You're not the first to report that. The doctor is a common sighting, usually on the ground floor near the old treatment rooms." "Who is he?" Mark asked, his skepticism fading in the face of the officer's matter-of-fact confirmation. "Dr. Mendel, according to hospital records. He was the chief psychiatrist from 1962 until his death in 1978. His methods were controversial, even for that time. After he died, there were investigations, former patients coming forward with stories of abuse, experimental treatments without consent. Nothing was ever proven conclusively, but the hospital's reputation never recovered. It closed 5 years later." "He looked so real," I whispered. "Not like a ghost from a movie, not transparent or floating. He was just there." "The stronger the emotion at death, the stronger the impression left behind," Sullivan said, his tone suggesting he'd given this considerable thought over the years. "And from what I've read about Dr. Mendel, he was not a man who would have accepted death easily." Jason shifted uncomfortably, wincing as he adjusted his weight off his injured knee. "So what happens now? Are you arresting us?" Sullivan sighed, seeming to remember his official role. "Technically, I should. Breaking and entering, trespassing on state property. Those are serious charges." He paused, then reached into his pocket and retrieved our IDs. "But I think whatever happened to you in there is punishment enough. Consider this a warning. If I catch any of you near this property again, I won't be so lenient." Relief washed over me as he handed back our driver's licenses. "Thank you, officer." "Don't thank me," Sullivan replied grimly. "Just stay away from this place. Whatever walks these halls doesn't distinguish between the curious and the malicious. It just knows you don't belong here." He escorted us to the gap in the fence, watching as we squeezed through one by one. "Your car at O'Malley's?" When we nodded, he added, "I'll follow you there. Make sure you leave town without any detours." The walk back to the bar was tense and silent, each of us lost in our own thoughts. Jason limped between Mark and me, occasionally needing support on the uneven ground. Behind us, Officer Sullivan's cruiser crawled along at walking pace, its headlights illuminating our path. When we reached Mark's car in the bar parking lot, Sullivan pulled up alongside us and rolled down his window. "One more thing," he said, his expression grave. "Whatever you experienced in there, It might not stay there. Some people report after effects, nightmares, feeling followed. If that happens, there's a woman in town, Eliza Chambers, runs the New Age shop on Main Street. She knows more about this place than anyone. Helped that college kid I mentioned. After effects? Mark repeated, a note of alarm in his voice. Sullivan nodded. Just be aware. Safe travels. As his cruiser pulled away, we stood beside Mark's car, the weight of the night's events settling around us like a shroud. Let's get out of here, Jason said, breaking the silence. I've had enough of this town to last a lifetime. The drive home was subdued, each of us processing what had happened in our own way. Jason sat in the back seat with his leg elevated, occasionally breaking the silence with a wince when we hit a bump in the road. Mark kept glancing at me, concern evident in his eyes. I stared out the window at the passing darkness, replaying the image of Dr. Mendel in my mind, the fury in his eyes when he realized he was seen, the aggressive gesture, the way he had turned and walked away as if to fetch something or someone. And I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed us out of that hospital. Something that even now watched from just beyond the reach of the headlights. 2 days later, I received a notice in the mail. Community service for trespassing, the result of Officer Sullivan filing a report despite his verbal warning. Mark and Jason received similar notices. We had gotten off lightly, all things considered. But as the days turned into weeks, I began to wonder if our punishment had truly ended when we left the hospital grounds. The nightmares started 3 days after our visit. Vivid dreams of endless hospital corridors, of being strapped to cold metal tables while figures in white coats loomed over me with instruments I couldn't identify. I would wake gasping for breath, the phantom sensation of icy hands on my skin lingering into wakefulness. And sometimes, in the liminal space between sleeping and waking, I would see him, Dr. Mendel, standing in the corner of my bedroom, watching with cold calculation, clipboard in hand, as if I were just another subject for his experiments. The human mind has remarkable defense mechanisms. As weeks passed following our encounter at the hospital, I found ways to rationalize what had happened, to file it away as an experience born of suggestion, darkness, and the power of Devil's Night to heighten perception. The nightmares gradually subsided, replaced by more mundane concerns, work, relationships, the day-to-day business of living. Mark and I broke up 6 months later, our relationship another casualty of that night, though neither of us would admit it. Something had changed between us, a shared trauma that paradoxically drove us apart rather than bringing us closer. He couldn't understand why I couldn't just get over it, and I resented his ability to dismiss what we had experienced as mere tricks of light and shadow. Jason moved away the following year, taking a job in another state. Before he left, he confided that he'd been to see Eliza Chambers, the woman Officer Sullivan had mentioned. She had performed some kind of cleansing ritual that Jason claimed had helped with his own nightmares. I nodded and wished him well, but didn't ask for Eliza's contact information. By then, I had convinced myself I was fine. Life moved on. I finished college, started a career, dated other people. The hospital became a story I occasionally told at parties when the conversation turned to supernatural experiences, though I edited out the more disturbing details, presenting it as a spooky adventure rather than the profoundly unsettling event it had been. And yet, despite my best efforts to normalize the experience, there were moments when the veil between my carefully constructed rationality and the truth of that night would thin, usually in October as Devil's Night approached, or when I would catch a glimpse of someone in a white coat from the corner of my eye. 4 years passed this way, with me balanced precariously between acknowledgement and denial of what had happened at the hospital. And then, on a rainy Sunday evening in 2015, the balance tipped. I was alone in my apartment, half watching a paranormal investigation show on television while scrolling through social media on my phone. It was the kind of program I usually avoided, too many staged reactions and questionable evidence for my taste, but nothing else was on, and the background noise kept the silence at bay. I wasn't paying full attention until I heard the host mention a location that made me freeze. Tonight, we're investigating one of America's most haunted abandoned hospitals, The former Riverview State Psychiatric Hospital. My head snapped up, phone forgotten as footage of the familiar Gothic facade filled the screen. It looked exactly as I remembered it, perhaps even more dilapidated after the additional years of neglect. Originally built in the 1920s as a tuberculosis sanatorium, the narrator continued, this imposing structure later served as a state psychiatric facility until its closure in 1983, amid allegations of patient abuse and controversial treatment methods. The camera panned across the hospital grounds, then cut to interior shots taken with night vision equipment. I recognized the reception area where we had entered, the long corridor of patient rooms, even the treatment areas with their ominous equipment still in place. Our investigation begins in the basement, the host explained, an area former staff members claim was used for the most extreme treatments and where current paranormal activity is reportedly most intense. I watched, transfixed, as the team made their way through the basement corridors, capturing strange noises and unexplained temperature fluctuations on their equipment. It was theatrical and over-dramatized, yet I couldn't look away, knowing what might await them. Then it happened. As one investigator stood alone in a basement corridor, his camera captured a figure moving across the hallway behind him. A solid-looking man in a white coat, moving with purpose from one room to another. "Oh my God," the investigator exclaimed when reviewing the footage with his team. "That's a full-bodied apparition." The show slowed down the footage, enhanced it, replayed it from different angles, and with each replay my blood ran colder. It was him, Dr. Mendel, the same stern expression, the same wire-rimmed glasses, the same purposeful stride, the same man who had locked eyes with me 4 years earlier. I fumbled for my phone, hands shaking so badly I could barely navigate to my contacts. Mark answered on the 4th ring, his voice wary. We hadn't spoken in over a year. "Turn on channel 11, I said without preamble. "Now." "What? Why?" "Just do it, please." I heard shuffling on his end, then the sound of a TV turning on. "The ghost hunting show? Since when are you into this fake—" "Just watch," I interrupted. "They're at the hospital, our hospital." Silence as he processed this, then, "I'll call you back in 5 minutes. Those 5 minutes stretched interminably as I continued watching the show, my entire body tense. When my phone finally rang, Mark's voice had lost all its earlier skepticism. "It's him," he said simply. "The doctor you saw. You believe me now?" I couldn't keep the accusation from my voice. Mark was quiet for a moment. "I never said I didn't believe you saw something. I didn't see him, so it was easier to think. That I was making it up, or crazy? No, not crazy. Just influenced by the setting, the stories, all of it." He sighed. "I'm sorry. Seeing him on video like that, it's hard to deny." We watched the remainder of the show together over the phone, commenting as the investigation team encountered more phenomena, disembodied voices captured on audio recorders, objects moving seemingly on their own, shadows moving against the flow of light. "Have you had any after effects?" Mark asked hesitantly when the show ended. "Like Sullivan warned about?" I considered lying, then decided against it. "Nightmares, mostly. They've gotten better over time. Sometimes I think I see him just for a second, but when I look again, there's nothing there." "Jason went to that woman Sullivan mentioned," Mark said. "Said it helped. He told me. Maybe you should—" "I'm fine," I insisted, the old defensiveness rising. "It's been 4 years. If something was going to happen, it would have by now." But even as I said the words, a familiar chill swept through my apartment, raising goosebumps along my arms. On the television, now muted, the credits rolled over still images from the investigation, including a freeze frame of Dr. Mendel's figure in the basement corridor. After hanging up with Mark, I found myself unable to settle. I paced my apartment, checking locks, adjusting lights, anything to keep moving. When exhaustion finally forced me to bed, I lay awake for hours, listening to the normal sounds of my building with heightened awareness. In the days that followed, I researched the hospital obsessively, reading everything I could find about its history and specifically about Dr. Isaiah Mendel. The internet yielded surprisingly little. A few mentions in digitized newspaper archives, references in academic papers about the evolution of psychiatric treatment, but nothing substantial about the man himself. I expanded my search to include the paranormal investigation show, discovering that the episode featuring the hospital had generated significant online discussion. In one forum thread, a commenter claiming to be a former orderly at the hospital shared stories that aligned disturbingly well with our experience. Lights operating without power, sounds of hospital activity long after the facility closed, and multiple sightings of Dr. Mendel, particularly near his former treatment rooms. The commenter wrote, "Mendel believed mental illness was a physical disease that could be excised like a tumor. His treatments were designed to cut out the sickness through electroshock ice baths, even experimental surgical procedures. He kept detailed records of everything, believing he was on the verge of breakthroughs that would revolutionize psychiatry. When he died unexpectedly of a heart attack in 1978, he was in the middle of a treatment session. The patient survived but was never the same afterward. The hospital tried to bury Mendel's more controversial work, burning records and dismantling equipment. But rumors persisted. Some say Mendel was so devoted to his work, so convinced of his methods, that death itself couldn't stop him from continuing his treatments." A chill ran through me as I read these words, remembering the burned patient files we had found, the equipment still in place as if waiting to be used again. Was it possible that what we had encountered was more than just a residual haunting, more than just energy impressed upon the environment? Could Mendel's consciousness somehow persist, continuing his work in some twisted afterlife? The question gnawed at me, making it difficult to concentrate on anything else. I found myself driving past the hospital whenever I was in the area, drawn to it despite the dread it inspired. I never went inside again. The memory of Officer Sullivan's warning and my community service experience was deterrent enough. But I would park across the street, watching the dark windows for any sign of movement. On one such evening, nearly 5 years after our original encounter, I noticed a small shop across from the hospital that I hadn't seen before. A converted Victorian house with a discreet sign reading, "Chambers Metaphysical." Eliza Chambers, the woman Sullivan had mentioned. I sat in my car for nearly an hour, debating whether to go in. What would I say? "Hello, a police officer told me 5 years ago that you might be able to help with my ghost problem." It sounded ridiculous, the kind of thing that would earn me a pitying look and perhaps a recommendation for psychiatric help. Yet as I watched the hospital in the gathering twilight, I could have sworn I saw a light moving behind one of the third-floor windows. A flashlight beam, perhaps, or something else entirely. Making my decision, I got out of the car and crossed the street to Chambers Metaphysical. A bell tinkled softly as I entered. The interior was not what I had expected. No crystal balls or gaudy mystical symbols, just a tastefully arranged shop with books, candles, herbs, and various metaphysical supplies. A woman looked up from behind the counter, her silver-streaked hair pulled back in a simple braid, her eyes sharp and assessing. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice carrying a slight accent I couldn't place. "Are you Eliza Chambers?" When she nodded, I continued hesitantly. "Officer Sullivan from the police department. He mentioned you might be able to help with after effects." Understanding dawned in her eyes. "The hospital," she said simply. It wasn't a question. "Yes, 5 years ago on Devil's Night." Eliza glanced at the clock on the wall, then moved to the front door and turned the sign to closed. "Come to the back," she said. "We'll talk." I followed her through a beaded curtain into a small sitting area. Comfortable chairs, a low table, shelves lined with books and curious objects I couldn't identify. She gestured for me to sit, then took the chair opposite mine. "Tell me everything," she said, "from the beginning." And I did, the story pouring out of me with a detail and emotional immediacy that surprised even me. I told her about entering the hospital, Jason's injury, our exploration, the lights coming on, hiding from what we thought were police, seeing Dr. Mendel, the confrontation with Officer Sullivan, and the years of nightmares and glimpsed figures that followed. Eliza listened without interruption, her expression revealing nothing. When I finished, she sat in silence for a long moment, her eyes focused somewhere beyond me. "Your friend, Jason," He came to see me before he left town, she said finally. I performed a cleansing for him, severed the attachment. It seems to have worked. He hasn't reported any further incidents. Attachment? I repeated, the word sending a shiver through me. Dr. Mendel is what we call a collector, Eliza explained. In life, he collected patients, subjects for his experiments. In death, he continues to collect. But now he's interested in minds that are receptive to the paranormal, individuals who can sense him, see him. Like me, I whispered. Eliza nodded. When you wrote your name on that chalkboard, you did more than leave graffiti. You announced yourself to the energies in that place. You made yourself known to him. And now he's... what? Following me, haunting me. Studying you, she corrected. As he studied his patients, the nightmares, the glimpses, these are his observations, his notes being taken. For what purpose I cannot say with certainty, but given what we know of the man's methods in life. She let the implication hang in the air between us, unspoken but understood. Dr. Mendel had been a man of extreme treatments, of pushing boundaries regardless of the cost to his subjects. If he was indeed studying me from beyond death, what would the culmination of that study look like? Can you help me? I asked, my voice small in the quiet room. Like you helped Jason? I can try, Eliza replied. But you must understand, this attachment has persisted for 5 years. It has had time to strengthen, to intertwine with your energy. Breaking it will not be easy, and it may not be complete. I'll take whatever help you can offer, I said, desperation edging into my voice. Eliza nodded and rose, moving to the shelves to gather various items, candles, herbs, small bottles of liquids, a ceramic bowl. As she worked, she spoke softly, almost to herself. Mendel was brilliant in his way, ahead of his time in some respects, though his methods were cruel by any standard. He believed the mind and body were inseparable, that mental illness manifested physically in the brain. Not a radical concept now, but then. It challenged prevailing theories. His error was in believing these manifestations could be treated like tumors, cut away, or shocked into submission. She returned to the table with her collected items, arranging them methodically. The irony is that in death, he has proven his own theory wrong. His consciousness persists without a physical form, demonstrating that the mind is indeed separable from the body. I watched as she lit candles, mixed herbs in the bowl, and added drops from various bottles. The air filled with an aromatic smoke that made my head feel slightly fuzzy. What happens now? I asked. I will attempt to create a barrier between you and Dr. Mendel's energy, Eliza explained. It won't erase what has happened, nor will it completely prevent him from reaching you if his will is strong enough. But it should weaken the connection, reduce the frequency and intensity of the experiences. For the next hour, Eliza led me through a ritual that blended elements I recognized from various spiritual traditions with techniques that seemed entirely her own. She had me visualize protective barriers, speak affirmations of strength and autonomy, and participate in cleansing practices involving the smoke and specially prepared water. Throughout the process, I experienced a range of sensations. Periods of intense cold, despite the warm room, pressure behind my eyes that built and then suddenly released. And at one point, a distinct feeling of anger that I somehow knew wasn't my own. When the ritual concluded, I felt lighter, as if something that had been clinging to me had been partially dislodged. Not completely removed, I could still sense a connection, thin but persistent, but weakened enough that I could believe in the possibility of eventually being free. It's done, Eliza said, extinguishing the last candle. How do you feel? Better, I admitted. Not completely. Clear, but better. She nodded, unsurprised. The connection remains, but it should continue to weaken over time, especially if you practice the visualization techniques I taught you. And there are additional steps we can take, if necessary. As I prepared to leave, reaching for my wallet, Eliza waved away my attempt to pay. Officer Sullivan sends people to me for a reason, she said. He understands what that place is, what it does to people. This is my way of balancing the scales in whatever small way I can. At the door, she placed a small fabric pouch in my hand, a charm of some kind, filled with herbs and other materials. Keep this with you, especially when you sleep, and stay away from the hospital. Your presence there strengthens the connection. I promised I would heed her advice, thanked her, and stepped back into the night. Across the street, the hospital loomed against the darkened sky, its windows black and empty, or almost all of them. On the third floor, a faint light moved behind one window, there and gone so quickly I might have imagined it. But I knew I hadn't. Years have passed since that night at Eliza's shop. The charm she gave me sits on my nightstand, replaced periodically when she sends me a new one. A service she provides without my asking, as if she knows when the previous one has lost its efficacy. The nightmares have largely subsided, and the glimpses of Dr. Mendel have become rare enough that I can go months without incident. I've moved forward with my life, building a career, forming new relationships, creating a normalcy that sometimes makes that devil's night in 2011 feel like something that happened to someone else. Until 2019, when I was browsing television channels and came across that paranormal investigation show. A different episode this time, but featuring the same team at a different location. I watched with mild interest, the production values and dramatic reactions as overblown as I remembered. And then they showed it, footage from their visit to the hospital years earlier, including the clip of Dr. Mendel walking through the basement corridor. The host explained that this remained one of their most compelling pieces of evidence, a full-bodied apparition captured clearly on camera. As the clip played in slow motion, I noticed something I hadn't seen before, a detail that sent ice through my veins, despite the charm sitting just feet away on my nightstand. In Dr. Mendel's hand, clearly visible as the enhanced footage played frame by frame, was a clipboard. And on that clipboard, just barely legible in the freeze frame, was a paper with what appeared to be a list of names. I paused the television and moved closer, my heart pounding as I struggled to make out the tiny text on the screen. Most of the names were too blurry to read, but at the bottom of the list, written clearly enough to be unmistakable, was my own name, the same name I had written on that chalkboard years ago. I still drive by the hospital occasionally, drawn by a morbid fascination I can't entirely explain. The building continues to decay, a planned demolition repeatedly delayed by budget constraints and preservationist concerns. Sometimes I see lights moving behind the windows, sometimes not. I've spoken with Mark a few times over the years, comparing notes on our experiences. He has had fewer lasting effects, perhaps because he never saw Dr. Mendel directly, never established that connection. Jason remains free of incidents, Eliza's intervention apparently successful in his case. He's built a new life in another state, married with children now, the hospital just a strange story from his youth. As for me, I exist in a liminal space. Not fully haunted, but not entirely free either. Dr. Mendel's presence in my life has diminished to a background awareness, like a radio playing in another room, too faint to make out the words but persistent enough to remind me it's there. I still have questions that may never be answered. What does he want from those he collects? Why does he continue his work beyond death? Is he trapped in some form of purgatory, condemned to repeat his life's obsessions, or is he acting with purpose and intention? Perhaps some questions are better left unanswered. Perhaps some connections, once formed, can never be completely severed, only weakened, managed, lived with. On Devil's Night each year, I take extra precautions, burning the protective herbs Eliza has provided, reinforcing my visualized barriers, keeping lights on throughout the night. And each year, as midnight approaches, I feel him testing those barriers, searching for weaknesses, for a way back in. So far, the barriers have held. But sometimes in the moments between waking and sleeping, I think I hear the scratch of a pen on paper, taking notes on my condition, my progress, my resistance. And I wonder if, somewhere in that decaying hospital, in a file bearing my name, Dr. Mendel continues to document his longest-running case study, waiting for the day when his treatment plan can finally be implemented. This happened about 2 years ago. My maternal grandmother, Eleanor, passed away 2 days before Christmas Eve in 2021. I remember the call came just after dinner on a Tuesday night. The hospital's number flashed on my phone, and I knew before I answered. Some part of you always knows. "She's gone," my mother said, her voice small and broken. "She went peacefully." Those words, "went peacefully," they're supposed to bring comfort, I think. But all I could picture was Eleanor lying alone in a sterile hospital room, her last breath escaping while machines beeped indifferently around her. There was nothing peaceful about loss. The days that followed blurred together. My mother moved through the house like a ghost, making phone calls, arranging funeral details, accepting casseroles from neighbors who didn't know what else to offer. My father tried his best, but grief was something he'd always kept at arm's length. He'd lost his own father young, and had learned to compartmentalize pain in ways I never could. Eleanor wasn't just my grandmother. She was the cornerstone of our entire family. Her modest 2-story house on Maple Street had been our sanctuary. The kitchen, with its perpetual smell of cinnamon and coffee, the sunroom where she'd sit with her crossword puzzles, pencil tucked behind her ear, the backyard with the tire swing that had survived 3 generations of children. "Remember when she caught us smoking behind the garage?" my cousin Thomas asked as we sat in my parents' living room the night before the funeral. The 4 of us, Thomas, Sarah, Lily, and myself, had gathered with a bottle of Eleanor's favorite bourbon. "A toast," we said, a wake of our own. "God, she was so mad," Sarah laughed, wiping at her eyes. "I thought she was going to tell our parents for sure." "But she didn't," I said, swirling the amber liquid in my glass. "She never did." Instead, Eleanor had sat us down at her kitchen table and talked to us like adults. She explained what cigarettes had done to her sister, our great-aunt June, who had died of lung cancer years before we were born. She didn't lecture or threaten. She just shared her pain and her fear of losing us the same way. None of us ever smoked again. That was Eleanor. She knew that shame and punishment didn't teach lessons. Love did. Understanding did. "She made me promise not to tell anyone when I flunked algebra," Lily said quietly. "She hired that tutor and paid for it herself. Said it was our secret." "She did the same when I wrecked my first car," Thomas added. "Helped me get it fixed before Dad ever found out." We sat in silence then, each lost in our own memories of her quiet interventions, her unconditional support, her fierce protection. Eleanor had been our confidant, our champion, our safe harbor in every storm. Christmas Eve came with a perverse insistence on normalcy. My mother had decided we would still gather, still exchange gifts, still eat the traditional ham and scalloped potatoes. "It's what she would have wanted," she kept saying, though her eyes remained distant, unfocused. I helped arrange chairs in the dining room, set the table with the good china, and folded napkins into perfect triangles, all the things Eleanor would have done. The house filled with relatives, their voices hushed, their hugs lingering a beat too long. No one mentioned the empty chair at the head of the table, though everyone's eyes drifted to it throughout the evening. After dinner, my Uncle David cleared his throat. "I'd like to say something," he began, raising his glass. "To my mother, who taught us all what it means to love without conditions, who showed us that family isn't just blood, it's choice, it's commitment, it's showing up even when it's hard." His voice cracked on the last word. "To Eleanor," we all murmured, glasses tilting toward the center of the table. I couldn't drink. The lump in my throat had grown too large, threatening to choke me. I excused myself and fled to the bathroom, locking the door behind me. The person in the mirror was a stranger, hollow-eyed, pale, with a brittle smile that threatened to shatter at any moment. I gripped the sink and tried to breathe through the tightness in my chest. "Get it together," I whispered to my reflection. "Just get through today." But I knew it wasn't just about getting through the day. It was about facing all the days that would follow, birthdays, holidays, ordinary Tuesdays, without Eleanor at their center. The funeral was worse. The chapel smelled of lilies and furniture polish, and the organ music seemed to scrape against my raw nerves. I sat between my mother and Sarah, clutching both their hands as the minister spoke of Eleanor's life, her faith, her devotion to family. Then came the eulogy. My Aunt Catherine stood at the podium, unfolding a piece of paper with shaking hands. "My mother wasn't perfect," she began, But she was perfectly herself. She loved fiercely and without reservation. She forgave easily, but never forgot a birthday. A ripple of sad laughter moved through the congregation. In her final days, when the pain was at its worst, she didn't talk about herself. She talked about all of you, her grandchildren especially. Catherine looked directly at us then, her eyes shining with tears. She told me, "Tell them they were the best thing that ever happened to me. Tell them they were my greatest joy. Tell them I cared for them more deeply than anything else in my life." The words hit me like a physical blow. A sound escaped me, something between a gasp and a sob. And suddenly I was crying without restraint, my body shaking with the force of it. Sarah's arm came around my shoulders, but it offered no comfort. Nothing could touch the yawning emptiness that had opened inside me. After the service, after the burial, after the reception where people ate finger sandwiches and spoke in reverent tones about what a wonderful woman Eleanor had been, I found myself standing in her empty house. My mother had asked me to pick up some photos for a memorial album she was creating, and I'd volunteered, needing some time alone with the ghost of her. The silence was absolute. No ticking grandfather clock. It had been moved to my parents' house. No humming refrigerator. It had been unplugged, cleaned, its contents distributed or discarded. No creaking floorboards under Eleanor's careful steps. Just emptiness. I moved through the rooms, touching surfaces, opening drawers, breathing in the fading scent of her. In her bedroom, I sat on the edge of her bed and ran my hand over the quilt she'd made decades ago. The stitches were uneven in places. Eleanor had never claimed to be an expert seamstress, but the love in every imperfect inch was palpable. On her nightstand sat a small leather-bound book. I knew I shouldn't pry, but grief makes trespassers of us all. I opened it to find her handwriting, cramped but legible, filling page after page. November 18th, Margaret called today. We talked about the grandchildren and how quickly they're growing up. She worries about hers the same way I worry about mine. Strange how similar our paths have been, despite everything. Margaret, my father's mother. My other grandmother, still very much alive but distant in ways Eleanor never was. They'd known each other for decades, of course, but I'd never thought of them as friends. The revelation that they spoke, shared concerns about us, was oddly unsettling. I closed the book and placed it back exactly as I'd found it. Some privacy should be respected, even in death. As I was leaving, a framed photo on the wall caught my eye. One I'd seen 1,000 times, but never really noticed. It showed Eleanor and Margaret, much younger, standing together at some long-ago family gathering. They weren't looking at the camera, but at each other, caught in mid-conversation, their expressions animated. There was an intimacy to it, a suggestion of shared secrets. I took the photo off the wall and added it to the box I was collecting. Something about it felt important, though I couldn't have said why. Driving home through the January darkness, snow beginning to fall in fat, lazy flakes, I felt a strange sense of foreboding. Not fear exactly, but awareness. As if the universe had shifted slightly and things that had been separate were now bleeding into one another. The grief was overwhelming and I hadn't even moved past the shock phase. It felt unreal, like Eleanor had just vanished, leaving behind an emptiness that no holiday lights or comforting words could fill. I kept expecting to hear her voice on the phone, to get one of her spontaneous, just checking in texts, to smell her perfume, white shoulders, old-fashioned and elegant like her. But there was nothing, just absence, just silence, just the hollow space where someone I loved used to be. January crawled by, each day indistinguishable from the last. I returned to work at the publishing house where I'd been an editor for 5 years, but found myself staring blankly at manuscripts, unable to focus on the words before me. My colleagues were understanding at first. Bereavement was allowed, expected even. But as weeks passed, their patience began to wear thin. "You need to talk to someone," my friend Denise suggested over lunch one day. "A professional, I mean." I pushed my salad around the plate, appetite absent as it had been since the funeral. "I'm fine." "You're not fine. You barely speak, you've lost weight, and yesterday I found you crying in the supply closet." I had no defense against the truth. I had been in the supply closet, clutching a package of Post-it notes to my chest, sobbing silently because they were the exact shade of yellow as Eleanor's kitchen curtains. "I'll think about it," I promised, though I had no intention of doing so. The idea of explaining my grief to a stranger seemed impossible. How could I articulate the specific ache of missing someone whose love had been the foundation of my entire life? The first strange occurrence happened on a Tuesday, exactly 1 month after Eleanor's death. I was at home, trying to focus on a manuscript that was already late for its deadline, when the lights flickered. Once, twice, then steadied. Power surges weren't unusual in winter, so I thought nothing of it until I heard the music. Faint at first, barely perceptible. Piano notes, delicate and familiar, drifting from somewhere in my apartment. I lived alone in a 1-bedroom unit, with no roommates and certainly no piano. I set down my pen and listened, trying to place the melody. Debussy, Clair de Lune, Eleanor's favorite piece, the one she'd play on her old record player on Sunday afternoons while she baked. I rose from my desk and moved through the apartment, following the sound. It seemed to be coming from the kitchen, but when I entered, the room was empty and silent. The music had stopped. "Hello?" I called, feeling foolish but unsettled. No response, of course. I checked every room, opening closets and even looking under the bed, though what I expected to find I couldn't say. Nothing was out of place. No one was there. Just my imagination, I told myself. Grief playing tricks on my tired mind. But the next day, it happened again. This time, the smell of cinnamon and apples filled my apartment for several minutes before dissipating. Eleanor's signature pie, the one she made every fall and winter, the recipe she had promised to teach me, but never had the chance. I called my mother, trying to keep my voice steady. "Have you noticed anything unusual since Grandma died?" I asked carefully. "What do you mean, unusual?" Her voice was guarded. "I don't know. Strange things. Things you can't explain." A long pause. "Like what?" I couldn't bring myself to tell her. It sounded too much like madness, like desperate wishful thinking. "Never mind. I'm just tired, I guess." "You should come for dinner this weekend," she said, changing the subject. "Your father misses you." I agreed, though the thought of their house, now filled with Eleanor's things, distributed among family members like relics, made my chest tight. That night I dreamed of Eleanor's house. In the dream I was walking through the familiar rooms, but they were empty of furniture, echoing with my footsteps. I called out for her, my voice bouncing off bare walls. When I reached the kitchen, I found not Eleanor but Margaret, my father's mother, sitting at the table. "She's trying to reach you," Margaret said, her eyes fixed on something over my shoulder. "She's worried." I turned to look, but there was only darkness behind me, a void that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. "Who's worried?" I asked, turning back to Margaret. "Eleanor?" But Margaret was gone, and the table with her. I stood alone in the empty kitchen as the darkness began to seep in through the windows, thick as tar. I woke with a gasp, sheets twisted around my legs, my nightshirt damp with sweat. The digital clock on my nightstand read 3:20 a.m., the exact time I would later realize that Eleanor had died in her hospital bed. The rest of the week brought more inexplicable moments. Objects moved when I wasn't looking. A book that had been on the coffee table appearing on my bedside table. My keys hanging on their hook when I was certain I'd left them in my coat pocket. The television turned itself on twice, always to the Food Network, which Eleanor had watched religiously. I began to wonder if I was losing my mind. The dinner at my parents' house that weekend was a strained affair. My father made awkward attempts at conversation, while my mother watched me with worried eyes, noting how little I ate, how often I checked my phone as if expecting a call. "How's Margaret?" I asked suddenly, the dream still vivid in my mind. My father looked surprised. "Mom, she's fine. Why do you ask?" "No reason. I just realized I haven't seen her since the funeral." "She asks about you," my mother said, her tone careful. "She worries." There it was again, that word, worries. Just like in the dream. "Maybe I should visit her," I suggested, though Margaret and I had never been particularly close. She lived on the other side of the city, in a retirement community that always smelled faintly of disinfectant and overcooked vegetables. I'm sure she'd like that, my father said, looking pleased. She gets lonely, especially since... He trailed off, but I knew what he meant. Since Eleanor died. The two women had been friends, after all. I remembered the photo I'd found, the one that suggested a deeper connection than I'd realized. After dinner, while my father watched television, my mother pulled me into the kitchen on the pretense of helping with dessert. "What's really going on with you?" she asked, her voice low. "And don't tell me nothing, I know you too well." I leaned against the counter, suddenly exhausted. I don't know how to explain it without sounding crazy. Try me. So I did. I told her about the music, the smells, the moving objects, the dream about Margaret, the constant, unshakable feeling that I was being watched, followed, reached for. My mother listened without interruption, her face unreadable. When I finished, she nodded once, decisively. "You're not crazy," she said. "Your Aunt Catherine has been experiencing similar things, so has Thomas." Relief washed over me, followed immediately by a new kind of fear. "What does it mean?" "I don't know." She took my hands in hers, her grip surprisingly strong. "But I do know my mother. If she's trying to reach someone from wherever she is now, she has a reason." We stood in silence for a moment, the implications of her words settling around us like dust. "Maybe you should talk to Margaret," my mother suggested finally. "She and Mom were closer than any of us realized. She might understand what's happening." I nodded, though the prospect filled me with a strange dread. "I'll call her tomorrow." But I didn't need to. When I returned to my apartment that night, there was a voicemail waiting on my phone. Margaret's voice, thin but clear. "Hello, dear. I've been thinking about you quite a bit lately. I wonder if you might come visit me this week. There's something I think we should discuss. Something about Eleanor." I played the message twice, goosebumps rising on my arms. How had she known? What could she possibly have to tell me about Eleanor that I didn't already know? I called her back immediately, despite the late hour. She answered on the first ring, as if she'd been waiting by the phone. "I'll come tomorrow," I said without preamble. "Is 3 o'clock all right?" "Perfect," Margaret replied, and I could hear the smile in her voice. "I'll make tea." That night, as I lay in bed trying to quiet my racing thoughts, the temperature in my bedroom dropped suddenly. My breath clouded in front of my face, and the radiator clanked futilely against the unnatural cold. Then came the whispers. So faint at first that I thought it was just the wind outside my window. But it grew clearer, more insistent. A woman's voice, speaking words I couldn't quite make out. "Hello?" I called, my voice trembling. "Is someone there?" The whisper stopped abruptly. The room remained cold, but the sense of presence, the weight of unseen eyes, intensified. Something brushed against my cheek, the lightest touch, like fingertips trailing gently over my skin. I froze, too terrified to move or speak. The touch came again, this time sweeping a strand of hair behind my ear, an achingly familiar gesture. Eleanor used to do the same thing when I was upset, a small, comforting ritual from childhood. "Grandma?" I whispered into the darkness. No answer came, but the cold began to recede. The room warmed gradually, the oppressive presence lifting like fog burning away in sunlight. I didn't sleep that night. I sat up in bed, lights on, waiting for something more, some clearer sign or message. But the apartment remained quiet, ordinary, as if nothing unusual had happened at all. By morning, I might have convinced myself it was a dream, a hallucination brought on by grief and exhaustion. Except for one thing. On my nightstand, where nothing had been the night before, sat a small silver locket. Eleanor's locket, the one she'd been buried with. I picked it up with shaking hands, the metal warm to the touch. Inside was a tiny photograph of the family, my parents, my aunts and uncles, all the cousins, taken at Eleanor's 75th birthday party. Her most treasured possession, she'd called it. The entire family, together and happy, in one perfect moment. The locket that should have been 6 feet underground, in a casket with her. I closed my fist around it, the edges digging into my palm. Whatever was happening went beyond grief, beyond imagination. Something impossible was unfolding around me, something that defied rational explanation. And somehow I knew that Margaret held the key to understanding it. Margaret's retirement community, Oakwood Gardens, was a cluster of tidy brick buildings surrounded by carefully manicured lawns. Despite the cheerful name and bright flowers planted along the walkways, there was something inherently sad about the place, a sense of lives winding down, of people waiting for an ending. I signed in at the front desk, where a young woman with tired eyes handed me a visitor's badge without looking up from her computer. "Building C, apartment 307, she said mechanically. The hallways smelled of industrial cleaner and cafeteria food. I passed a common room where elderly residents sat in a circle, half-heartedly participating in what appeared to be a trivia game. One woman caught my eye as I walked by, her gaze sharp and knowing, as if she recognized me. I hurried past, uncomfortable under her scrutiny. Margaret's door was decorated with a wreath of artificial autumn leaves, despite it being the dead of winter. I knocked, adjusting the strap of my bag where Eleanor's locket now resided. I couldn't bring myself to wear it, but neither could I leave it behind. The door opened almost immediately, as if she'd been standing just on the other side, waiting. "There you are," Margaret said, her smile warm but her eyes assessing. "Right on time." My paternal grandmother had always been a striking woman, tall and elegant, even in her advanced years. At 84, her hair was silver white but still thick, pulled back in a neat chignon. She wore a deep blue sweater that brought out the color of her eyes, the same eyes my father had, the same eyes I saw in the mirror every morning. Come in," she urged, stepping aside. "The tea is ready." Her apartment was small but immaculate, decorated in shades of blue and cream. Photos lined the walls and shelves. My father as a child, my parents' wedding, my high school graduation, and I noticed with surprise several of Eleanor. The two women together at various family functions, arms linked, laughing into the camera. "You're noticing the photos," Margaret said, following my gaze. "Eleanor and I were great friends, you know. More than friends, really." She gestured for me to sit on the sofa while she poured tea from a delicate porcelain pot. The cups matched, pale blue with gold rims, elegant and old-fashioned. "I didn't realize you were so close," I admitted, accepting the cup she offered. "I mean, I knew you knew each other, obviously, but you thought we were just connected through the family?" Margaret smiled slightly. "No, our relationship went much deeper than that. We met long before your parents did, in college, actually. We were roommates my freshman year, her sophomore year. This was entirely new information. I'd never heard either grandmother mention knowing each other before my parents' marriage. Eleanor never told me that. No, she wouldn't have." Margaret took a small sip of her tea, her eyes distant with memory. "It was complicated, our friendship. There were gaps, times when we didn't speak, but we always found our way back to each other. Always." She set down her cup and leaned forward, her gaze suddenly intense. "But that's not why I asked you here. You've been experiencing things, haven't you, since she passed?" The directness of the question caught me off guard. "How did you know?" "Because I have too." Her voice was matter-of-fact, devoid of the fear or uncertainty I felt. "She's reaching out, trying to communicate something. But why? And why to us specifically?" The questions that had been tormenting me spilled out. "And why does she seem so restless? I thought she died peacefully." Margaret's expression softened. "Death isn't always the end of a story, dear. Sometimes it's just a comma in a very long sentence." She rose and crossed to a small writing desk in the corner of the room. From a drawer, she withdrew a leather-bound journal similar to the one I'd found in Eleanor's bedroom. "Your grandmother and I had a pact," she explained, returning to her seat. "We promised that whoever went first would try to send a message back, if such a thing was possible. A confirmation, if you will, that consciousness continues." "A message?" I repeated, struggling to reconcile this metaphysical pact with the practical, no-nonsense women I'd known my grandmothers to be. Eleanor was always more open to these possibilities than me. She had experiences as a young woman that convinced her there was more to reality than what we can see and touch. Margaret tapped the journal. She documented some of them here. She handed me the book, which fell open to a page marked with a silk ribbon. The handwriting was Eleanor's, dated just 3 months before her death. I dreamt of the in-between place again last night. That space where the living and the dead can almost touch, separated by the thinnest of veils. I was trying to reach someone. I couldn't see who, but my hands kept passing through them as if they were smoke. Margaret says I've become obsessed with these dreams, but how can I not be when the end draws closer? If there's a way to bridge that gap, to reach back after I'm gone, I need to find it. For them, for all of them. I looked up from the page, my heart racing. What does this mean? What was she trying to do? Eleanor believed that love was stronger than death, Margaret said simply. That with enough will, enough intention, the barrier could be crossed. Not to return to life, she wasn't fool enough to believe that, but to communicate, to finish whatever remained unfinished. And you think that's what's happening now? She's trying to communicate? I know it is. The question is why. What message is so important that she's expending such energy to deliver it? I reached into my bag and withdrew the locket, holding it out on my palm. This appeared on my nightstand last night. It was buried with her. Margaret went very still, her eyes fixed on the silver oval. May I? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, and she took it carefully, examining it as if it were a precious artifact, which in a way it was. A physical object that had somehow traversed the boundary between worlds. This changes everything, she murmured. This isn't just communication. This is a manipulation of physical matter. She's stronger than I imagined. A chill ran through me at her words. Is that normal? Margaret gave a short, humorless laugh. None of this is normal, dear, but it is significant. She handed the locket back to me. She chose you specifically to receive this. You must be central to whatever message she's trying to convey. The responsibility of that selection felt suddenly overwhelming. But why me? Why not my mother or one of her other children? That's what we need to discover. Margaret set her teacup down with a decisive clink. I think it's time we tried to speak to her directly. My stomach lurched. You mean like a seance? Nothing so theatrical. Just an opening of awareness, an invitation. Eleanor and I researched these methods extensively in our later years. We were preparing, you see. The casual way she spoke of communicating with the dead, as if it were as ordinary as making a phone call, left me speechless. These were my grandmothers, women who had baked cookies and knitted Christmas sweaters, women I'd thought I knew completely. Yet here was this whole other dimension to their relationship, their beliefs, their lives that had been entirely hidden from me. When? I asked finally. Tonight would be best. The barrier is thinnest in the early morning hours, around 3:20 actually. The time on my clock when I'd awakened to the cold room, the whispers, the touch, the time of Eleanor's death. How did you know that was when she died? I asked, suspicion suddenly flaring. The family was told it happened sometime during the night. The exact time wasn't shared. Margaret's smile was enigmatic. Eleanor and I had no secrets from each other, at least not in the end. She rose again, this time moving to a cabinet where she withdrew a small wooden box. Take this home with you. Inside is everything we'll need. I'll come to your apartment at midnight. That will give us time to prepare. I accepted the box, which was heavier than it looked, carved with intricate symbols I didn't recognize. Margaret, I'm not sure about this. What if something goes wrong? Her expression softened, and for a moment I saw the grandmother I was more familiar with, the one who had brought presents at Christmas and taught me to play gin rummy. Eleanor would never harm you, she said gently. Whatever is happening, whatever she needs to communicate, it comes from love. Remember that. As I left Oakwood Gardens, the strange woman from the common room was standing in the hallway. Up close, I could see that her eyes were two different colors, one brown, one a pale, almost translucent blue. She's caught between, the woman said as I passed, her voice reedy but insistent. Neither here nor there. The between place is dangerous. Be careful who you invite in. I hurried past without responding, clutching Margaret's wooden box to my chest, the weight of the locket in my bag suddenly seeming to increase with every step. The rest of the day passed in a haze of nervous anticipation. I called in sick to work, not entirely a lie, as my stomach churned with anxiety, and tried to distract myself with mundane tasks. I cleaned my apartment, paid bills, even attempted to work on the manuscript that was now dangerously overdue. Nothing held my attention. The wooden box sat on my coffee table, unopened. I couldn't bring myself to look inside, afraid of what I might find. Part of me wanted to call the whole thing off, to return the box to Margaret and pretend none of this was happening. But the memory of that gentle touch in the darkness, the strand of hair tucked behind my ear, so specifically Eleanor, kept me from reaching for the phone. If there was even the slightest chance of saying goodbye properly, of understanding what she needed to tell me, how could I turn away? As the day waned and darkness fell, the apartment grew increasingly quiet. Not just silent, but a deep, waiting stillness that seemed to press against my ears. The air felt thick, charged with potential energy. At precisely 11:45 p.m., a knock came at my door. Margaret stood in the hallway, now dressed in a simple black dress with a silver pendant at her throat. "You didn't open the box," she said as she entered. Not a question, but an observation. I wasn't sure what to expect. She nodded, understanding. Fear is natural. But remember, this is Eleanor we're trying to reach. Your grandmother. She loved you more than life itself. Margaret moved to the coffee table and opened the box, revealing its contents. 3 white candles, a small silver bell, a pouch of what looked like dried herbs, and a framed photograph of Eleanor. One I'd never seen before, showing her as a young woman, perhaps in her 30s. Her expression serious, but her eyes bright with intelligence. "We'll need a table," Margaret instructed, her manner now businesslike. "Preferably round, but any will do." I cleared my small dining table, and together we arranged the items from the box. Margaret placed the candles in a triangle formation with the photograph of Eleanor at the center. She sprinkled some of the dried herbs, a mixture that smelled of lavender and something sharper, almost metallic, around the perimeter. "The locket," she said, holding out her hand. "It will serve as a connection, a tether." I hesitated before drawing it from my pocket. The metal seemed warmer than it should be, almost pulsing against my palm like a tiny beating heart. Margaret took it and placed it carefully beside the photograph. "Now we wait," she said, checking her watch. "It's nearly midnight. The veil begins to thin." We sat across from each other at the table, the candles casting long shadows that danced on the walls. Margaret's face in the flickering light looked different somehow, younger, sharper, her eyes reflecting the flames until they seemed to glow from within. "What exactly are we waiting for?" I whispered, not wanting to break the heavy silence that had descended. "A sign," she replied. "Eleanor will let us know when she's ready to communicate." The minutes ticked by, measured by the soft sound of my wall clock and our steady breathing. Outside, the wind picked up, whistling around the corners of the building. The candle flames wavered, but didn't extinguish. At 3:15 a.m., the temperature in the room plummeted. My breath clouded in front of my face, and shivers racked my body. Margaret, however, seemed unaffected by the cold. Her posture relaxed, her breathing even. "She's coming," she murmured, her gaze fixed on something over my shoulder. "Can you feel her?" I could. The same presence I'd sensed before, a weight, a watching, a silent anticipation. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and my skin prickled with gooseflesh. "Eleanor," Margaret called softly, "we're here, we're listening." The candle flame stretched upward, elongating into thin blue-white spears of light. The locket on the table began to vibrate, then to spin slowly on its chain. "What's happening?" I gasped, fighting the urge to flee the room. "She's gathering energy," Margaret explained, her voice calm. "Drawing from the electrical field, from the heat, from us. It takes enormous effort to breach the veil." The spinning locket moved faster, becoming a silver blur. The photograph of Eleanor seemed to ripple, as if the paper itself was becoming fluid. And then I felt it, the same gentle touch on my cheek, the same sensation of fingers brushing hair from my face. But this time, it didn't stop there. The touch moved to my shoulder, a pressure like a hand resting there, solid and real. "Grandma?" I whispered, my voice breaking. The clock struck 3:20 a.m. with a soft, mechanical click. The candles extinguished simultaneously, plunging the room into darkness, save for the faint moonlight filtering through the blinds. And in that silver-blue illumination, she appeared. Right next to my chair, barely 20 centimeters from my face, floated the body and face of a woman. Not Eleanor, as I had half expected, but Margaret, my father's mother, her features exactly as they had been just moments before, across the table from me. But that was impossible, because Margaret was still sitting there, her outline visible in the dim light, her hands flat on the table's surface. I stared at the floating figure, my mouth open in shock. My body refused to move. My first thought was sleep paralysis. I had heard of people hallucinating strange figures during those episodes, but this felt too real. The details of her face, the way she seemed solid, it wasn't like a fleeting shadow in the dark. This was something else. Finally, I managed to sit up straighter, rubbing my eyes, trying to force the illusion away. I even slapped myself, hard enough to sting. But nothing changed. She was still there, floating, staring at me with a soft, knowing smile. And then, the realization hit me like a punch to the chest. Oh my God, that's my grandmother from my father's side. She is still alive. Panic surged through me. My breath came in short gasps, and before I could stop myself, I blurted out, "What the hell is happening?" The figure just kept smiling, calm and unshaken. She had Margaret's face, her hair, her warm eyes, the same ones that had looked at me countless times with love. But something was off. Her legs were missing, her body fading into nothing below the waist, like she had been cut off from reality itself. She didn't feel threatening, but there was something deeply unsettling about it. A ghostly version of my living grandmother was standing in my room, reaching across some unseen boundary to visit me. Why? Why now? Despite my fear, I felt an overwhelming curiosity, like a force I couldn't resist. Slowly, I reached out my hand toward the figure, and to my utter shock, she reached back, her fingers wrapped around mine, firm but cold, like touching something that wasn't meant to exist in this world. She smiled at me then, her eyes closing as if in peace. For what felt like minutes, we just stayed there, frozen in that impossible moment. Then, without a sound, she began to drift backward. Slowly, she glided toward my closed bedroom door, fading as she moved. And just like that, she was gone. I turned to the table where the real Margaret still sat, her expression unreadable in the darkness. "What just happened?" I demanded, my voice shaking. "What did I just see?" Margaret sighed, a long, weary sound. "Not what we expected," she admitted. "Not Eleanor at all." "It was you," I said. "But you're right here. How is that possible?" She reached out and relit one of the candles with a match from her pocket. In the renewed glow, I could see that her face had changed, aged somehow in the space of minutes. New lines etched around her eyes and mouth, and her hair seemed duller, less vibrant. "The body you saw wasn't me," she said softly. "It was a projection, a construct created by Eleanor." "But why would she appear as you? Why not as herself?" Margaret's eyes filled with tears, the first time I had ever seen her cry. "Because she's trying to warn you, about me." "Warn me about you?" I repeated, struggling to make sense of her words. "I don't understand." Margaret reached for the locket, which had stopped spinning and now lay still on the table. She opened it, revealing the family photograph inside. "Look closely," she instructed. "What do you see?" I leaned forward, examining the tiny image. It showed the family gathered around Eleanor at her birthday party, my parents, my aunts and uncles, all the cousins. And standing beside Eleanor, her arm linked through my grandmother's, was Margaret. "I see everyone," I said, "the whole family, you and Eleanor." "Look at my eyes," Margaret insisted. I peered closer, straining to make out details in the small photograph. And then I saw it. In the picture, Margaret's eyes were different colors. One brown, one a pale, almost translucent blue, like the woman at Oakwood Gardens, the one who had warned me about the between place. I jerked back, the realization hitting me with physical force. "Who are you?" I demanded. "If you're not Margaret—" "I am Margaret," she interrupted, her voice gentle but firm. "Just not the Margaret you think you know." She took a deep breath as if gathering courage. "Eleanor and I met in college, as I told you. We became very close, more than friends. We fell in love." The admission hung in the air between us. recontextualizing everything I thought I knew about my grandmothers. I remained silent, waiting for her to continue. It was 1958. Such relationships weren't accepted, weren't even spoken of. We kept our love secret for years, but eventually, the pressure became too much. I broke things off, married your grandfather, had your father. Eleanor married too, had her children. We lived the lives that were expected of us. She touched the photograph in the locket with trembling fingers. But we never stopped loving each other. After both our husbands passed, we reconnected. These past 15 years we've been together, not openly. We still kept that private, but together in all the ways that mattered. Why didn't you tell anyone? I asked, though I thought I already knew the answer. The generation they came from, the small town they lived in, the conservative families they belonged to. We were going to, Margaret said, a sad smile playing at her lips. After all these years, we'd finally decided it was time. Eleanor wanted to tell the family at Christmas, that last Christmas she didn't live to see. My mind raced, putting pieces together. So the warning, the apparition. Eleanor knew she was dying, Margaret explained. Long before she went into the hospital that final time, she made me promise that if she didn't get the chance to tell everyone the truth, I would do it for her. She looked down at her hands, which I now noticed were trembling. But I was a coward. At the funeral, at the Christmas gathering, I couldn't bring myself to speak up, to reveal what we'd hidden for so long. I told myself it didn't matter anymore, that the truth could die with her. But she doesn't want it to, I said slowly, understanding dawning. She wants you to fulfill your promise. Margaret nodded, tears now flowing freely down her lined face. She's caught between, not fully at peace because of this unfinished business. The woman you saw at Oakwood wasn't a resident. No one else could see her. She was another message, another warning. The realization left me breathless. All this time, the strange occurrences, the sense of presence, the impossible apparition. It wasn't just Eleanor reaching out from beyond. It was Eleanor trying to ensure that their love story wasn't buried with her. The projection you saw tonight, Margaret continued, was Eleanor showing you what's to come. What will happen to me if I don't fulfill my promise? What do you mean? I'm dying, she said simply. Cancer. I've known for months, but I haven't told anyone, not even your father. The doctors give me weeks, perhaps a month. Eleanor knew. She was the only one I told. She's afraid I'll take our secret to my grave as well, that we'll both be caught in that in-between place, unable to move on. The shock of this new revelation left me momentarily speechless. Another grandmother slipping away, another loss looming on the horizon. So what will you do? I asked finally. Margaret straightened her shoulders, a new resolve visible in her posture. I'll tell them, all of them, the truth about Eleanor and me, about what we meant to each other, but I'll need your help. My help? You were closest to Eleanor. Of all the grandchildren, you were the one she confided in most. If you stand with me, accept our truth. The others will follow your lead. I thought about Eleanor, the grandmother who had been my safe harbor, my confidant, my champion. The woman who had taught me that love was the most important force in the universe. How could I do anything but honor her final wish? Of course I'll help you, I said, reaching across the table to take her hand. It felt fragile in mine, the bones prominent beneath paper-thin skin. We'll tell them together. Margaret's relief was palpable, her entire body seeming to lighten. Thank you, she whispered. Eleanor knew you would understand. She always said you had the biggest heart of anyone she'd ever known. The candle between us flickered, and for just a moment, I thought I caught a glimpse of another figure standing behind Margaret. Tall, elegant, with Eleanor's unmistakable profile. But when I blinked, the shape was gone. The next few days passed in a whirlwind of phone calls and arrangements. Margaret moved in with my parents temporarily, a development that surprised my father, but that he accepted with characteristic pragmatism. We scheduled a family gathering for the following weekend, ostensibly to share Margaret's medical diagnosis, but with the deeper purpose understood between just the two of us. The night before the gathering, I dreamed of Eleanor again. This time, she wasn't in her empty house, but in a garden I didn't recognize, filled with lilacs and roses, her favorite flowers. She sat on a stone bench, her back straight, her face younger than I'd ever known it in life. "You did well," she said as I approached in the dream. "You understood." "I miss you," I told her, sitting beside her on the bench. "Every day." "I know, sweetheart, I miss you too. But I'm not entirely gone, you know. Not as long as you remember me." "Will I see you again? After tomorrow, I mean." Eleanor smiled, reaching out to tuck a strand of hair behind my ear. "Not like before. Once Margaret shares our truth, I'll be able to move on. But I'll always be with you, in ways you might not expect. Are you happy wherever you are?" "Getting there," she said with a small laugh. "It's a process, like everything worthwhile." She stood then, smoothing down her dress, the blue one she'd worn to my college graduation. "It's time for me to go, and for you to wake up. Remember what I told you at the hospital? That we were your greatest joy," I recalled, my throat tightening with emotion. "That you cared for us more than anything." "Yes, and that will never change no matter where I am." She leaned down and kissed my forehead, her lips cool against my skin. "Goodbye for now, my darling. Take care of Margaret for me. She'll need you in the days ahead." I woke with tears on my cheeks, but a strange peace in my heart. The air in my bedroom was warm, fragrant with the unmistakable scent of lilacs and roses, though there were no flowers in my apartment. The family gathering the next day was tense at first, weighted with the knowledge of Margaret's diagnosis. We gathered in my parents' living room, the same room where we'd toasted Eleanor with bourbon a few months earlier, and listened as Margaret explained about her cancer, about her decision to forego treatment at her age, about her wish to spend her remaining time with family. And then, with a steadying glance at me, she took a deeper breath and continued. "There's something else I need to tell you," she said, her voice stronger than it had been in days. "Something about Eleanor and me. Something we should have told you years ago." The story unfolded gradually. Their meeting in college, their secret relationship, their separate marriages and lives, their reconnection in later years. Margaret spoke without shame or apology, her dignity intact, even as tears slipped down her cheeks. "We loved each other," she concluded simply. "For over 60 years, through everything we loved each other. And before she died, I promised I would tell you the truth, that I wouldn't let our story end in silence." The room was quiet when she finished. My mother was the first to move, crossing to where Margaret sat and enveloping her in a gentle embrace. "I think I always knew," she murmured. "The way you looked at each other. I just never put it into words." Others followed. My father, awkward but sincere in his acceptance. My aunts and uncles, some surprised. Others nodding as if pieces of a long unsolved puzzle had finally clicked into place. My cousins, the youngest generation, for whom such relationships were far less shocking than they had been in Eleanor and Margaret's youth. Thomas was the last to speak, his voice thick with emotion. "Grandma Eleanor would be proud of you," he told Margaret, "for keeping your promise, for being brave." As the family surrounded Margaret with love and support, I felt a subtle shift in the atmosphere, a lightening, a release of tension I hadn't even realized was present. The heavy silence that had filled every corner of my life since Eleanor's death seemed to lift, replaced by a quiet acceptance. That night, as I lay in bed reflecting on the day's events, I felt a final gentle touch on my cheek, the lightest brush of fingertips, a familiar gesture of comfort and love. I didn't open my eyes, didn't need to see to know who it was. "Goodbye, Grandma," I whispered into the darkness. "Be at peace." The touch withdrew, and with it went the last traces of the cold, the whispers, the sense of watching eyes. Eleanor had finished what she needed to do. Her story was complete. Margaret lived for exactly 1 month after that day, passing peacefully in her sleep with my father at her bedside. We buried her next to Eleanor, as she had requested, with a shared headstone that bore no dates, no relationships, just their names and a simple inscription: "Love endures all things." The locket remained with me, a tangible reminder of a love that had transcended conventional boundaries, that had reached across the veil between life and death to ensure its truth was known. Sometimes, in the quiet hours before dawn, I still find myself reaching for it, running my fingers over its smooth surface, remembering, not with fear or unease, but with gratitude for the lesson Eleanor and Margaret taught us all, that love, in its purest form, cannot be confined by society's expectations, by time, or even by death itself. It endures, it persists, it finds a way to make itself known, and in the end, that's all that remains.